There are moments in history that seem to vanish, not with a whisper, but with a silence so complete it echoes through time. Civilizations that once carved their power into stone, gone without explanation. Cities that hummed with life, reduced to ruins without a single record of their fall. Entire chapters of the human story, erased, redacted, or buried so deep we can only grasp at fragments. Who were these people? What did they know? And why does it feel like someone, or something, wanted us to forget? Across deserts, beneath jungles, and hidden under the sea, we find traces that don't quite fit. Tools too advanced for their era. Maps that show lands supposedly unknown. Symbols etched into stone that no one alive today can read. Each discovery raises more questions than answers, pulling us deeper into a past we were never meant to understand. But tonight, we're going to try. So dim the lights, let your imagination drift beyond the limits of recorded time, and join us as we uncover the lost pages of history, one mystery at a time. In the southern reaches of the Arabian Peninsula, where the desert meets the highlands and the wind whispers through forgotten valleys, there once rose a kingdom of wealth and wonder. Today, the land is dry, scattered with the broken bones of ancient architecture, weathered stones that once formed walls, temples, and palaces. These silent ruins belong to the Kingdom of Saba, a civilization that flourished in what is now modern-day Yemen, and whose memory still lingers like perfume in the dry heat. Known to the ancient world as Sheba, Saba was a land of frankincense and myrrh, of gold and spices, commodities so valuable that they shaped the course of empires. Saba's people commanded the incense routes, those winding desert trails that funneled aromatic resins northward into the markets of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Mediterranean. With every caravan, Saba grew wealthier, more sophisticated, and more mysterious. What we know of Saba is pieced together from scattered inscriptions, fragmented ruins, and the echoes found in ancient texts. The Hebrew Bible speaks of a queen of Sheba who journeyed to visit King Solomon, bringing with her lavish gifts and riddles to test his wisdom. Islamic tradition names her Bilqis and grants her a palace of wondrous design, one so advanced it boasted a floor of glass that mimicked a pool of water. But beyond these legends, what was the true nature of this lost kingdom? Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of a vast and organized civilization. The capital, Marib, was once home to the Great Dam, an astonishing feat of ancient engineering that allowed the Sabaeans to tame the desert and sustain a thriving agricultural society. Stretching over 2,000 feet and dating as far back as the 8th century BC, the dam collected monsoon rains and diverted them into fertile fields. Inscriptions in the Sabaean script speak of kings and dynasties, of wars, treaties, and religious offerings to a moon god named Almaka. The people of Saba were literate, politically complex, and technologically skilled. And yet, something doesn't quite add up. For all its sophistication, the story of Saba remains incomplete. The rise of the kingdom is only faintly understood, and its sudden decline even more so. By the 6th century AD, Saba had vanished from the historical stage, absorbed or replaced by rival powers, its capital abandoned, its dam crumbling. How could such an influential civilization disappear so thoroughly, leaving behind so few definitive answers? Some scholars suggest that environmental collapse played a role, that the failure of the dam, perhaps due to overuse, earthquakes, or neglect, spelled doom for an economy so dependent on irrigation. Others point to the shifting tides of trade. As new maritime routes opened across the Red Sea, the incense routes declined, and with them, the fortunes of inland kingdoms like Saba. But beyond the rational explanations lie deeper enigmas. Inscriptions from neighboring civilizations mention Saba with awe, even reverence. The Greeks and Romans wrote of its legendary wealth, calling it Arabia Felix, fortunate Arabia. Yet no one can say with certainty how far Saba's influence truly reached. Some fringe theorists suggest that Saba may have had colonies or outposts along the coast of East Africa, or even connections to the ancient world's most elusive cultures. Could there have been a deeper exchange of knowledge, technology, or beliefs, one lost to time? Then there is the question of the Queen of Sheba herself. While mainstream historians consider her likely a literary composite, perhaps based on a powerful Sabaean ruler, others believe she may have been a real monarch, one whose reign was deliberately erased or whose story was exaggerated to the point of myth. The lack of a definitive royal tomb, combined with vague references in multiple traditions, keeps the debate alive. Some speculate that her palace still lies undiscovered beneath the sands or hidden among the hills. And what of Saba's spiritual world? The moon god Al-Makka was central to their belief system, yet his cult vanished almost without trace. What did the Sabaeans see in the night sky that made them revere the moon above all else? Were their temples observatories? Did they mark time, or seasons, or something more arcane? Perhaps even something they believed descended from the stars. As modern conflict makes large-scale excavation in Yemen difficult, much of Saba remains hidden, literally and figuratively. Satellite images suggest the presence of unexcavated sites. Inscriptions sit unread in forgotten corners. Artifacts lie buried, waiting for an era of peace that may never come. The Kingdom of Saba endures, not as a political power, but as a riddle carved into stone and scattered across the desert. We can see its shadows in the legends of distant lands, feel its presence in the scent of incense, and trace its borders in the broken walls of Marib. But the heart of Saba, its ambitions, its fears, its truths, remains just beyond reach. What did they know that we don't? What secrets lie waiting beneath the sand? Let's keep searching. Not far from the banks of the Mississippi River, in the heart of what is now the American Midwest, an ancient landscape rises from the earth in silent defiance of time. Grassy mounds, some modest, others towering as high as a 10-story building, dot the horizon like the remnants of a forgotten world. At the center stands Monk's Mound, a vast earthen pyramid meticulously crafted by hand, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This is Cahokia, the crown jewel of the Mississippian Civilization, a culture that, centuries ago, turned forests and floodplains into a vibrant urban sprawl, and then vanished. At its height, around the year 1100 AD, Cahokia may have housed as many as 20,000 people, comparable in size to London at the same time. It was a city of engineers, artists, and astronomers, a place of sacred geometry and celestial alignments. Here, entire communities gathered around central plazas and temples, their lives seemingly guided by a complex spiritual and social structure. The civilization stretched across what are now dozens of U.S. states, from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast, linked by shared iconography, mound-building traditions, and a far-reaching trade network. And yet, the Mississippians left behind no written language, no known chronicles, no engraved records to explain who they truly were, how they rose so quickly, or why they disappeared. The archaeological remains tell part of the story. At Cahokia and other mound sites, such as Moundville in Alabama or Etowah in Georgia, researchers have uncovered sophisticated urban planning, wooden palisades, astronomical markers, and ritual objects carved from shell, stone, and copper. Burials beneath the mounds hint at a stratified society with elites and religious leaders, suggesting a theocratic or possibly hereditary ruling class. At the heart of Cahokia's ceremonial life was Woodhenge, a large circular structure made of wooden posts, aligned with the solstices and equinoxes. Much like Stonehenge in England, it likely served as a solar calendar, used to mark time and possibly to signal important religious events. But what cosmology guided this construction? What beliefs drove a people to build such monuments, hauling tons of earth basket by basket? Mainstream theories propose that Cahokia was the result of population surges and agricultural innovations, particularly the cultivation of maize. This abundance likely fueled rapid growth, leading to complex social structures, specialized labor, and a centralized authority. But others argue that this alone cannot explain the scale of its monuments or the uniformity of cultural practices across such a vast and varied region. There are signs that the Mississippians observed the heavens with precision. Artifacts bearing motifs of the birdman, solar symbols, and depictions of the cosmos suggest a worldview shaped by cycles, dualities, and transformation. Some archaeologists believe these patterns hint at a unified religious ideology, perhaps a priestly class that maintained order through ritual, celestial timing, and fear of the unknown. Others wonder if they were influenced by even older cultures to the south. Could the Mississippians have been in contact with Mesoamerican civilizations? Parallels in iconography, particularly the feathered serpents and ceremonial plazas, have led some to speculate on cultural diffusion between the two regions. While no direct evidence confirms this link, the mystery persists. How did a civilization in North America, without stone tools, wheels, or beasts of burden, create urban centers that rivaled their southern counterparts in complexity and symbolism? And then, just as quickly as they rose, they were gone. By 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. The great mounds fell silent. Woodhenge rotted. Trade routes dissolved. What caused the sudden and irreversible decline? Environmental evidence points to deforestation, flooding, and crop depletion, perhaps aggravated by an extended drought. There are signs of social unrest, too, signs of violence, hastily built fortifications, and mass burials. Did the society collapse under its own weight? Was there famine, war, disease, or something else entirely? Some suggest the abandonment may have been ritual, part of a cycle of renewal we no longer understand. Others believe it was gradual disintegration, eroded by ecological stress and internal conflict. And yet, some theorists point to deeper enigmas. They wonder if the Mississippian civilization was part of a much older continuum, an echo of an even more ancient tradition lost to time, a thread that re-emerged briefly before vanishing again beneath the surface of history. Adding to the intrigue is the way Native American oral histories often sidestep direct references to Cahokia and its builders. Some traditions speak of great cities swallowed by time, of sky people and earth movers. But no tribe claims direct descent from the mound builders of Cahokia. Was the knowledge lost through generational trauma and colonial displacement? Or was the culture already shrouded in mystery, even to those who came after? Today, the great mounds stand like tombstones of a forgotten era, green, still, massive. And though tourists wander the site and archaeologists continue their careful work, most of Cahokia remains unexcavated. Beneath the soil lie clues we have not yet uncovered, and perhaps some we're not prepared to understand. What knowledge guided the hands that built these monuments? What stories were whispered beneath the stars as Woodhenge cast its shadow? And why did they leave, never to return? The Mississippian civilization leaves us with more questions than answers. And in that silence, something stirs. Just beyond the dusty plains of southwestern Iran, where the Zagros Mountains rise like silent sentinels above the horizon, lie the crumbled remains of a forgotten empire. The sun casts long shadows over ancient foundations and broken reliefs, their lines eroded by time but still echoing with a faint, elusive memory. This is the land of Elam, a name barely spoken in most histories, yet one that once struck fear and fascination across the ancient Near East. The ruins of Susa, once a vibrant Elamite capital, now lie buried beneath layers of sediment and silence. And yet, beneath those ruins, a civilization older than Persia, older even than Babylon, waits patiently to be remembered. From as early as 2700 BC, the Elamites carved out a realm of influence that lasted, in one form or another, for more than 2,000 years. They traded with Sumer, warred with Akkad, and left behind temples, administrative tablets, and cryptic inscriptions. But despite this long presence, their voice in history remains muted. Who were the Elamites, really? And why does their story feel like a whisper in a room filled with louder, better-known empires? The Elamite language itself is a puzzle. It is not Semitic. It is not Indo-European. It belongs to no known linguistic family. Despite countless efforts, no clear connection has ever been made between Elamite and any other language, ancient or modern. It stands alone, an island in a sea of tongues. What kind of people speak a language with no relatives? Were they remnants of an even earlier civilization, a forgotten migration, or something more enigmatic entirely? Their script, too, evolved independently. While Sumerians and Akkadians developed cuneiform for their own needs, the Elamites initially crafted Linear Elamite, a rare, undeciphered script that remains one of the last uncracked codes of the ancient world. In recent years, scholars have made progress interpreting its symbols, yet many of its texts still defy translation. What knowledge lies hidden in those clay tablets? What histories remain locked behind those unread lines? Unlike their more monumental neighbors, the Elamites favored smaller, compact cities. Their temples were modest but intricate, their art distinct, filled with geometric patterns, mythic beasts, and deities unlike those found in Mesopotamia. At the heart of their belief system stood the goddess Kiririsha, often referred to as the Great Lady. Alongside her was Napirisha, the supreme god of the highlands. But even here, their religion stands apart, unique, regional, and difficult to place within broader mythological frameworks. What rituals took place in their sanctuaries? What cosmology guided their rulers? One of the most striking aspects of Elamite culture was its role as both rival and mystery to Mesopotamia. To the Babylonians and Assyrians, Elam was a perennial thorn in the side, distant, powerful, unpredictable. Elamite armies marched on They looted cities, captured kings, and once even stole the sacred statue of Marduk from Babylon itself. In turn, they were demonized in texts and cursed in myths. But why such animosity? Was it simple rivalry, or did the Elamites hold something more ancient, more feared than what we now understand? Their art tells a quieter story. Elamite reliefs show refined techniques, advanced metallurgy, and a striking attention to detail. In the archaeological layers of Haf Tepe and Choga Zanbil, we find ziggurats and burial complexes that rival the finest constructions of the time. Choga Zanbil's massive ziggurat, built by the Elamite king Untash-Napirisha around 1250 BC, remains one of the best preserved in the world, a testament to their engineering and religious dedication. Yet, unlike Babylon's structures, the purpose of many of these Elamite monuments is still debated. Were they administrative centers, ritual complexes, or symbols of forgotten theological truths? Then, there's the enigma of Elam's end. The empire's fall wasn't a single event, but a series of erasures. By the 6th century BC, the Elamites were absorbed by the growing Persian Achaemenid Empire. Their language faded, their gods were forgotten. Even their memory became distorted, reduced to a name on tablets and an occasional footnote in foreign chronicles. Some scholars argue that Elam didn't collapse, but quietly merged with Persia, becoming part of the cultural DNA of a new empire. Others believe the disappearance was more deliberate, a suppression of a rival culture, or the slow erosion of a people whose origins were too different to assimilate. More speculative theories have also emerged. A few suggest that the Elamites preserved knowledge far older than their neighbors, a thread connecting them to prehistoric civilizations that may have existed long before recorded history. Their unique language and isolated cultural traits, in this view, could be remnants of a forgotten branch of humanity's earliest settlements in the Fertile Crescent. Could they have been descendants of a primordial people whose memory has been lost to time? As of today, the Elamite script still resists full translation. Their mythology remains fragmented. Their history is told more often by those who oppose them than by their own voices. And their greatest monuments, like Chogha-Zanbil, sit quietly under the sky, rarely visited, barely studied. What legacy lies buried beneath the dust of Susa? What truths are sealed inside the unread tablets of linear Elamite? And why does this civilization, so long-lasting, so different, remain one of the most obscure? The Elamites may be gone, but their silence speaks. And in that silence, a question lingers. What if the oldest stories are the ones we've forgotten how to hear? High in the rugged highlands of the central Andes, where the earth splits into steep valleys and the air carries the scent of stone and altitude, lie the fractured remains of a forgotten capital. Dust clings to the weathered blocks of massive walls, their angles once carefully fitted together, now softened by centuries of silence. This is the city of Wari. Stone by stone, a civilization built in the clouds and then lost. Long before the Inca rose to power, long before their vast network of roads and temples sprawled across South America, the Wari forged an empire here, one of the first true imperial powers of the Andes. From around 600 to 1000 AD, they governed a territory that stretched hundreds of miles, from modern-day Ayacucho to the distant Pacific coast, across desert, jungle, and mountain. And yet, today, their name barely flickers in public memory. Who were the Wari, and why does a civilization so advanced, so organized, vanish with so few clues? The ruins of their capital, near present-day Ayacucho, hint at a society of remarkable complexity. The layout is grid-like, precise, an early testament to urban planning. Structures are built from finely cut stone and mud brick, forming courtyards, galleries, and ceremonial enclosures. There are underground chambers, ventilation systems, and hints of water management, designs that speak not only to practicality, but to a deeper, more symbolic order. At the heart of the Wari world stood control, not just of space, but of people, resources, and belief. Unlike the decentralized cultures that came before, the Wari developed a bureaucratic state, complete with administrative centers, storehouses, and outposts. They used terraced agriculture to reshape mountain slopes and dry canal networks to irrigate parched valleys. At its height, the Wari Empire may have served as the blueprint for the Incas, who later adopted similar methods of governance and expansion. But despite these advances, the Wari left behind no written language. Their stories were not recorded on scrolls or carved into stone. What survives are fragments, intricate textiles, ceramics adorned with geometric patterns and fierce deities, and bones buried deep in sealed chambers. Their iconography, rich and abstract, suggests a highly developed cosmology, one in which death, transformation, and duality played central roles. What gods did they worship? What rituals governed their lives? Perhaps the most haunting discovery comes from the necropolises found beneath Wari territory. Dozens of mummified remains, sometimes buried in fetal positions, others entombed in multi-level chambers with offerings and ceremonial vessels. Some tombs appear communal, suggesting a collective identity in death. But others, such as those found at the site of Castillo de Warmay, revealed something more unexpected. An elite class of women, adorned in gold and fine cloth, laid to rest with reverence. Were they priestesses, rulers, matriarchs of a forgotten dynasty? Mainstream archaeology suggests the Wari rose to power through a combination of diplomacy, military force, and religious influence. Their art spread across vast distances, and evidence of centralized planning suggests a highly coordinated state. Yet, unlike empires that fell to conquest, the Wari did not end with a clash of armies. There was no dramatic collapse etched into memory, just a slow, inexplicable disappearance. By the 11th century, their cities were being abandoned. Their infrastructure, roads, canals, temples, fell into disuse. The central government fractured. But why? Some scholars point to environmental stress, extended droughts that made agriculture unsustainable, especially in the highlands. Others cite internal unrest or the overextension of administrative control. Still, the truth remains frustratingly unclear. No great fire marks their cities. No mass graves speak of war. The Wari simply faded. And then, there are the more speculative threads. Some researchers propose that the Wari worldview itself might have contributed to their dissolution, that their system, deeply embedded in ritual and cyclical thinking, may have required periodic abandonment or transformation. That collapse, in their context, wasn't necessarily seen as failure, but as a transition. Others wonder if their disappearance was a form of intentional retreat, an elite society choosing to withdraw from centralized power into smaller, kin-based groups to avoid instability. A few fringe theories even suggest that the Wari might have had contact beyond the Andes. Comparisons have been drawn between their iconography and motifs found in distant Mesoamerican cultures. Could there have been long-distance exchange of ideas, of goods, of beliefs that mainstream history has yet to uncover? And what of their legacy? The Inca Empire, centuries later, would rise in the very same terrain, adopting many of the same strategies: road networks, administrative hubs, terraced farming. Some believe the Inca may have inherited more from the Wari than we realize, that the bones of their empire were already embedded in the landscape. Yet even the Inca spoke little of them. Did they forget? Or were they deliberately erasing a predecessor whose memory carried power? Today, the Wari remain both present and absent, visible in their stones, their artifacts, their roads, yet elusive in meaning. Without texts, we are left to interpret symbols, to read the language of layout, of color, of burial. And always, just beyond the edge of understanding, is the sense of something deeper, something that refuses to be fully explained. What truths are woven into their silent textiles? What stories lie sealed beneath the unexcavated soil of their cities? And why did one of the Andes' greatest empires choose to disappear into history's shadow? The Wari built an empire without leaving a voice, and yet somehow their silence still speaks. As the dust swirls over the parched plains of the Indus Valley, it gathers around the ruins of a once great civilization. Crumbling walls of kiln-fired brick rise faintly above the earth, straight lines, right angles, and silent streets that haven't echoed with footsteps in nearly 4,000 years. These are the remains of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, ancient cities of the Indus Valley Civilization. Grids, drainage systems, and uniform architecture suggest an advanced society, meticulously ordered and deeply thoughtful. But somewhere beyond the crumbling foundations and unearthed artifacts, there is a silence that has yet to be broken. A long silence, a dark age. Between 1900 and 1300 BC, the Harappan world dimmed, cities emptied, writing ceased, craftsmanship declined, and the great Indus Valley Civilization, once spanning over 500,000 square miles from modern-day Pakistan to western India, entered what scholars now call the Harappan Dark Age. But what caused one of the world's earliest urban cultures to collapse so quietly and so completely? The facts are haunting in their precision. Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, each was a masterpiece of early city planning. They had broad streets, complex drainage, granaries, and standardized weights and measures. They built without kings, palaces, or war monuments. Their script, still undeciphered, appears on seals, tablets, and pottery shards, hinting at a rich symbolic language we can no longer read. Then, slowly, the structures stopped being maintained. The bricks grew brittle, the writing disappeared, and the once bustling cities turned to dust. Mainstream historians have proposed a series of plausible theories. Environmental change looms large. Geological evidence suggests that rivers shifted course, most notably the drying up of the Ghaggar Hakra, often identified with the ancient Sarasvati. When the rivers moved, so did the lifeblood of agriculture, trade, and urban life. Climate change also plays a role. Around the same time, the monsoon patterns weakened, crops failed, droughts grew longer. For a civilization built around water management and seasonal rhythms, this would have been catastrophic. But is that the whole story? The archaeological record doesn't show widespread warfare or invasion. There are no burnt layers consistent with citywide destruction. Instead, we see gradual decline, urban centers giving way to smaller, rural settlements. Was this a planned retreat, a cultural transformation, or something else entirely? The Harappan script remains one of the great undeciphered writing systems of the ancient world. Without a Rosetta Stone to unlock its meaning, we are left only with patterns and symbols. Elephants, tigers, unicorn-like creatures, ritual scenes. What were they trying to tell us? Were these economic records, sacred texts, decrees, or poetry? And what of the people themselves? Skeletal remains from late Harappan contexts reveal signs of stress, malnutrition, disease, and trauma. But they also hint at a multicultural population. Some researchers suggest there was a mixing of groups during the later phases, internal migrations, the integration of new communities. Was this a melting pot or a fracture? Were these newcomers refugees, conquerors, or kin? Among the most contested ideas is the proposed arrival of Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples into the subcontinent during or shortly after the decline. Some argue that this wave introduced Vedic traditions, replacing or absorbing the Harappan legacy. But others challenge the timing, pointing instead to continuity, that Harappan ideas, practices, and even elements of their language filtered quietly into later Indian culture. Could the Vedas themselves, India's foundational spiritual texts, contain echoes of the Harappan worldview, masked by time and translation? Then there are the more speculative threads. Some point to the eerie uniformity across the Indus cities, how bricks were made to a consistent ratio, how weights and measures were standardized over vast distances. What kind of governance could coordinate such unity without apparent kings, armies, or central temples? Was there a forgotten order, a council, a priesthood that ruled not through force, but through systems? Others note the striking absence of ostentatious burial sites. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, the Harappans left no great tombs, no golden graves, no megalithic self-monuments. Were they egalitarian by design? Or was their wealth hidden in ephemeral forms, rituals, language, philosophy, now lost beyond the reach of stone? And what of Mohenjo-Daro's so-called Great Bath? This massive, watertight structure, built with baked bricks and sophisticated drainage, seems to have had ritual significance, but its exact purpose remains unclear. Was it a place of purification, a temple basin, or something more symbolic, perhaps a portal between worlds? The Harappan Dark Age is not just a mystery of loss. It is a mystery of silence. A society that seemed to function without warfare or tyranny, without lavish self-glorification, and yet reached remarkable heights in engineering, sanitation, and trade, vanished, leaving behind only clues we're still learning to interpret. Today, the sites of the Indus Valley sit quiet beneath the heat. Excavations continue, but political borders, environmental challenges, and the sheer scale of the terrain slow the search. Meanwhile, the seals remain untranslated, the rivers remain dry, and the people remain nameless. What wisdom was encoded in the Harappan script? What values allowed them to build such balanced, resilient cities? And what broke that balance? And why, for all their brilliance, did they leave without a voice? Perhaps the answers lie buried in the alluvial soil, or perhaps they linger in the myths and memories of a land that still remembers, even if faintly. In the hills of the Peloponnese, scattered among olive groves and limestone cliffs, lie the ruins of once glorious cities, Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos. Cyclopean walls of massive stone blocks still stand in solemn defiance, their purpose long abandoned, their builders long forgotten. Above them, the sky turns slowly over an empty land, and the wind carries no voice. This is the silent heart of a forgotten era, a time between legends and history, between the fall of a civilization and the rise of a new world. This is the Greek Dark Ages. Around 1200 BC, the palatial centers of the Mycenaean world collapsed. Great citadels burned, writing vanished, trade networks dissolved, and the vibrant, interconnected Bronze Age society of the Aegean faded into obscurity. What followed was nearly 4 centuries of silence, a time when the Greeks themselves seemed to forget who they were. But how does a world unravel so completely? Archaeological remains from the late Bronze Age paint a picture of wealth and complexity. The Mycenaeans built fortified palace complexes, administered elaborate bureaucracies, and maintained trade routes stretching from Egypt to the western Mediterranean. They left behind linear B tablets, administrative documents that reveal a tightly organized society rich in agriculture, warfare, and ritual. Their cities were centers of culture and power. Then, suddenly, nothing. By the end of the 12th century BC, those tablets stopped being written. The palaces crumbled, burial practices changed, pottery grew simpler. For nearly 400 years, from approximately 1100 to 750 BC, the historical record grows dim. The Greeks stopped writing. Monumental architecture disappeared. Urban centers became smaller or were abandoned altogether. Mainstream scholars suggest a confluence of catastrophes. Earthquakes may have struck key cities. Invasions, perhaps by the mysterious sea peoples, could have overwhelmed fragile defenses. Internal revolts, famine, and drought may have compounded the crisis. A once cohesive world may have been undone by its own complexity, its systems too fragile to withstand simultaneous shocks. And yet, these explanations still leave gaps. Why was the collapse so widespread? Why did it reach across the Aegean, affecting not only Greece, but also Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant? How did so many advanced societies fall in near unison, and how did they all enter a prolonged silence? Some theorists propose a more gradual cultural shift, a transformation rather than a total collapse. They point to continuity in certain settlement patterns, to traditions that persisted even as the Mycenaean order faded. Was it truly a dark age, or a time of slow adaptation, a rebalancing of social structures that eventually gave rise to the classical world. Others look to the legends. The Greek Dark Ages gave birth to stories. The oral tradition flourished as the written word disappeared. Tales of gods and heroes, of Troy and Odysseus, were passed down through generations. Homer's epics, though committed to writing centuries later, are believed to echo memories of this lost world. Could the Iliad and the Odyssey be more than myth? Could they contain fragments of real events encoded in poetry? There are hints, too, in the material culture. In places like Lefkandi on the island of Euboea, archaeologists have discovered unusually rich burials from the so-called Dark Period. One grave contains a man and woman buried together, the man cremated, the woman inhumed, a ritual pairing unlike anything seen before. Nearby, the remains of a large wooden structure suggest communal gatherings or ritual use. Was Lefkandi a hidden center of continuity? A flicker of elite culture surviving in the shadows? And what of the strange phenomenon of iron? The transition from bronze to iron occurred during this period, but not as a technological revolution, more as a quiet, almost reluctant shift. Bronze had dominated for centuries, dependent on tin and copper from distant lands. As trade collapsed, access to tin declined. Iron, though more difficult to work, became the metal of necessity. This material transformation reshaped warfare, economy, and society. Was this a cause of collapse, or its symptom? Fringe theories abound. Some suggest a cometary impact, pointing to sudden climate anomalies and global upheavals. Others propose lost knowledge, deliberately suppressed or destroyed, that once guided the palace societies. A few even question whether the Mycenaeans were the true authors of their own civilization, or whether they inherited something older, now lost entirely. But what is perhaps most mysterious is what followed. By the 8th century BC, something stirred again in the Greek world. The alphabet appeared, borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians. Cities began to grow. Temples rose. Sculpture and pottery became expressive, intricate, and with it came a new identity. The birth of the polis, the rise of citizenry, the spark of philosophy. Out of silence came a renaissance, yet the centuries in between remained dim. Who held the stories during those quiet generations? What was remembered and what was lost? Did a cultural memory survive beneath the ashes of the palaces, whispered in firelight until it took form again in verse? The Greek Dark Ages remain a chasm in our understanding, too advanced to ignore, too fragmented to fully explain. And in that chasm lies a question. How much of civilization can vanish before we forget it ever existed? As the sun sets over the eastern Mediterranean, it casts long golden shadows over shattered stones and half-buried temples. These are the remnants of a vanished world, cities once lit by oil lamps, bustling with scribes, traders, kings, and priests. Now only fragments remain, broken tablets, collapsed palaces, charred layers in the earth. Between 1200 and 1150 BC, a great silence descended. Across 3 continents, the lights of civilization flickered and then went dark. This was the Bronze Age collapse, a moment in history so vast, so abrupt, and so devastating that it still confounds historians today. In the centuries before the collapse, the ancient world was thriving. Egypt's new kingdom stood as a beacon of power. The Hittites ruled Anatolia. The Mycenaeans commanded Greece. The Canaanite city-states traded across the Levant, and the mighty kingdom of Ugarit hummed with diplomatic correspondence and commercial ambition. These societies were linked by a complex web of trade, politics, and shared knowledge. Tin and copper moved across deserts and seas to forge bronze. Spices, textiles, and grain changed hands in a tightly woven network that stretched from Mesopotamia to the Aegean. Then, one by one, the great cities fell. In Ugarit, clay tablets recording desperate pleas for help were left in kilns that were never opened. In Mycenae, palaces burned and never rebuilt. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was abandoned, swallowed by the mountains. In Egypt, Pharaoh Ramses III fought off invasions from mysterious outsiders, peoples without names, arriving by both land and sea. These were the Sea Peoples, as later Egyptian inscriptions would call them. But who were they? Mainstream theories attempt to map the contours of this collapse: climate change leading to prolonged droughts and famine, earthquakes shaking cities to rubble, waves of migration disrupting fragile balances. There is evidence of all these. Grain records from Egypt show sharp shortages. Dendrochronology, tree ring studies, suggests abrupt climatic shifts, and archaeological layers across the region reveal signs of destruction, abandonment, or sudden cultural change. Yet no single explanation seems sufficient. How could so many sophisticated societies, each with their own strengths, armies, economies, and infrastructures, fall together within a single human lifetime? The Sea Peoples remain one of the most tantalizing enigmas of this era. Egyptian reliefs show chaotic naval battles, foreign warriors in feathered helmets, and strange armor storming the delta. Were they displaced tribes fleeing climate catastrophe? Mercenaries turned against their employers? Or agents of a deeper disruption, perhaps driven by famine, desperation, or ideology? Some historians suggest that the very complexity of the late Bronze Age world made it vulnerable. As cities became more interconnected, they also became more interdependent. A disruption in one region, crop failure, piracy, a collapsed trade route, could send ripples across the entire system. When trade slowed, bronze production faltered. When economies collapsed, palace economies unraveled. Did the collapse begin not with war, but with silence? With missed shipments, unfulfilled treaties, and markets gone quiet? Others propose that internal unrest played a crucial role. In several sites, such as Mycenaean Greece, there are signs of social upheaval: fortifications rapidly built, elites buried hastily, centralized power visibly fracturing. Could the collapse have been, at least in part, a series of revolutions? Did peasants and laborers rise against the palatial order? And still others ask darker questions. What if the collapse wasn't merely a reaction to crisis, but a deliberate erasure? Could there have been ideological movements, religious or political, that sought to destroy the old order, not preserve it? Were temples and archives burned not by accident, but by design? Then there is the archaeological silence that follows. After the collapse, writing disappeared in many regions. Monumental construction ceased. Long-distance trade diminished drastically. In Greece, the linear B script vanished, and it would be centuries before a new writing system emerged. Across the Levant, new cultures arose in the ruins of the old, but with fewer luxuries, smaller settlements, and fewer connections. It was a time of survivors. And yet, not everything was lost. Some seeds endured. Ironworking began to spread, perhaps first in Anatolia, where the Hittites had experimented with the material, and then into the wider Mediterranean. Simpler, more decentralized societies took root. Oral traditions preserved memories of the old world. In time, new civilizations would emerge, from the ashes of the Hittites, the Phrygians, from the silence in Greece, the city-states of the Archaic period, and in Canaan, the small, once marginal tribes that would become the Israelites. Still, the Bronze Age collapse remains a mystery. How could a world so advanced vanish with such suddenness? What roles did drought, war, migration, and ideology each play? And who were the Sea Peoples really? Invaders, refugees, or messengers of a deeper reckoning. We dig, we analyze, we theorize. But much of this ancient collapse remains beneath the soil, beyond translation, beyond certainty. What knowledge disappeared when the tablets stopped being written? What truths lie buried in the ruined palaces and unmarked graves of the late Bronze Age? Perhaps the collapse was not the end of an age, but the erasure of a question we still don't know how to ask. As the early morning mist curls through the valleys of central Italy, it rolls over the low hills of a city not yet destined for empire. Rome, before marble, before empire, before Caesar, was a city of mud-brick homes, narrow streets, and wooden defenses. In the year 390 BC, or perhaps 387 depending on the source, this still young republic faced a terror it would never forget. Not from Carthage, nor from within its senate, but from the north, from a people the Romans called the Gauls. What followed would scar Roman memory for centuries. The first sack of Rome, a moment when the eternal city nearly ceased to exist before it had even begun its long ascent. It began with the Battle of the Allia, north of the city, where the Roman army met a migrating force of Senioni Gauls led by a chieftain named Brennus. According to ancient sources, the clash was sudden, chaotic. Roman formations collapsed under the wild ferocity of the Gauls. The defeat was so devastating, so shameful, that the Romans would henceforth treat the date of the battle, July 18th, as cursed, a day of ill omen for generations to come. The survivors fled. The city lay open. What happened next has become a fog of fear and legend. The Gauls marched into Rome. They looted and burned. According to Livy, the sacred geese of Juno warned the defenders at the Capitoline Hill of a night assault, saving what little remained. And yet, most of Rome was reduced to smoldering rubble. The temples desecrated, the archives lost, statues smashed. The early history of Rome, perhaps even much of its founding narrative, was quite literally burned to ash. But how much of this story is true? Here, the sources diverge. The accounts we have, chiefly from Livy, Polybius, and Plutarch, were written centuries after the fact, shaped by Rome's later grandeur and need for myth. Livy describes a dramatic confrontation. After months of siege, the Romans agree to pay a ransom in gold. But when they protest the Gauls' use of rigged weights, Brennus throws his sword atop the scales and utters the infamous phrase, "Vae victis," woe to the vanquished. It's an iconic moment. But was it real? Or the invention of a Rome that needed to remember defeat, heroically? No archaeological layer definitively confirms a widespread sack of Rome in 390 BC. Some evidence of destruction exists, but it's fragmentary. Possible fires, a disruption in building patterns, signs of sudden abandonment. Yet the material silence is striking. If the city was indeed leveled, why is the destruction so difficult to trace? Some historians propose that the sack may have been exaggerated or even partially fabricated, that a smaller raid or diplomatic standoff later morphed into a legendary catastrophe. Others suggest the opposite, that it was even worse than the sources say, but that the chaos and disorganization of early Rome left few records to preserve the truth. After all, the early Roman Republic lacked monumental stone architecture. Much of the city was built of wood and clay, easily destroyed, easily forgotten. And what of the Gauls themselves? To the Romans, they were barbarians, fierce, uncivilized, driven by plunder. But the Senones were part of a complex Celtic world stretching from Gaul to the Danube, with their own culture, craftsmanship, and warrior traditions. Their incursion into Italy was not random. It was part of a broader wave of migration and pressure, driven perhaps by population shifts or competition for land. Were they invaders or refugees, opportunists or the victims of a deeper continental turmoil? Some fringe theories even suggest a more unsettling possibility, that the Gauls were not simply raiders, but messengers of a broken system, remnants of another collapsing order, echoing the wider instabilities of the post-Bronze Age Mediterranean. A ripple effect, long delayed, now reaching into the heart of the Italian peninsula. In the years that followed the sack, the Romans rebuilt quickly. They raised new defenses, restructured the city, and passed laws to prevent such disarray again. But the trauma lingered. Rome's obsession with discipline, order, and military readiness, the hallmarks of its future empire, may have been born from this single wound. Even centuries later, Roman generals would invoke the sack of Rome as a warning. It became the symbol of vulnerability, a reminder that even the mighty can fall. Yet many questions remain. What truly happened during those days when Rome was in flames? How much of our understanding is shaped by myth, by pride, by fear? And what truths might still lie hidden in the ash, beneath the forum, beneath the foundations of empire? The sack of Rome by the Gauls marks a turning point, not just in history, but in memory. A moment when a city was nearly erased, and in that near erasure, discovered what it would need to become. But behind the legend, the story still smolders. And perhaps, somewhere beneath the stones, the truth is still waiting to be uncovered. As winter lifts from the broad plains of Eastern Europe, the landscape begins to stir. The forests open to winding rivers that reflect the pale sky, and the wind carries the faint scent of pine and thawed earth. These are lands once walked by unknown tribes, quiet settlements nestled near lakes, modest tools left buried in the soil, and whispered songs now lost to time. It is here, between the Carpathians and the Baltic, in the deep heart of early Europe, that the story of the Slavs begins. Or, perhaps more accurately, where it disappears. The early Slavic migrations are not written in ink, but in the shifting soil of forgotten graves and scattered pottery shards. Between the 5th and 7th centuries A.D., a quiet expansion unfolded across the continent, sudden in its breadth, yet frustratingly opaque. A people without cities, without stone monuments, and without a native script spread across thousands of kilometers. From the cold marshes of Polisia to the warm valleys of the Balkans, the Slavs moved. But who were they before they moved? And why does their early story remain so difficult to trace? Before the Great Migrations, the Slavs are almost invisible in the historical record. Classical writers say little. Tacitus, Pliny, Ptolemy, they mention names like the Veneti or Sclaveni, but with uncertainty, confusion, and broad strokes. These early references are sparse, scattered, and often second-hand. No Slavic texts remain from this time, no stone inscriptions, no chronicles. And yet, archaeologically, something changes. Around the 5th century A.D., distinct cultural patterns begin to emerge: ceramic styles, house structures, and burial customs that suggest a shared identity, even if the name Slav would only later be assigned. Small villages appear across the Pripet marshes and along the upper Dniester, built not for defense, but for subsistence. There is little gold, no great temples, only modest dwellings, simple tools, and scattered signs of ritual. What motivated their sudden movement? Mainstream theories suggest a combination of population pressure, environmental shifts, and the vacuum left by the collapsing Roman and Gothic frontiers. The world was in flux. The Western Roman Empire had fallen. The Huns had come and gone. Germanic tribes were on the move, and borders, once rigid, had blurred. Into this chaotic landscape, the Slavs expanded. They crossed rivers. They climbed mountains. They entered lands once ruled by emperors and kings. In some places, they settled peacefully. In others, they clashed with lingering imperial forces. Byzantine chroniclers, writing from the safety of Constantinople, spoke of Slavic raiders appearing along the Danube, swift and numerous, slipping through defenses like water through broken stone. But were these invaders or settlers, raiders or refugees? The picture grows more complex with every excavation. In Bulgaria, Romania, and the former Yugoslav lands, Slavic material culture mingles with that of other peoples. There are traces of assimilation, of syncretism, pagan rituals alongside Christian icons, local ceramics reshaped by foreign hands. Was this the blending of cultures, or the quiet erasure of those who came before? Some scholars argue that the early Slavs may have been less a single ethnic group than a fluid confederation, bound by language and shared customs, but not yet a defined people. Others propose that the Slavs had long existed in the shadow of larger civilizations, Scythians, Goths, Sarmatians, and only emerged into visibility when those shadows fell away. And then, there are the mysteries that defy easy categorization. The linguistic unity of the Slavic languages is striking. Despite their vast geographic spread, the core grammar and structure of Slavic tongues suggest a relatively recent divergence. How could a people spread from the Adriatic to the Volga, from the Elbe to the Aegean, in such a short span, and retain such linguistic coherence? Was their migration more rapid than we assume? Or were they already more widespread before history took notice? Fringe theories abound. Some propose that the Slavs were descendants of ancient Indo-European groups who had remained hidden or overlooked by classical observers. Others suggest that they were pushed into motion by environmental catastrophe, plague, drought, or volcanic winter, forcing a cultural migration that left little trace. There are even whispers among the more speculative thinkers of lost Slavic kingdoms, proto-states that rose and fell without leaving written record. Oral traditions speak of vanished leaders, buried cities, and battles not found in any chronicle. Could there have been forgotten centers of Slavic power, eclipsed by time and conquest? Whatever their origin, the early Slavs reshaped the map of Europe. Within a few centuries, they formed kingdoms: Great Moravia, the Kievan Rus, the Bulgarian Empire. They adopted Christianity, developed alphabets, and became the foundation for modern Slavic nations. But their earliest chapter, the moment before memory, remains one of the least understood migrations in recorded history. What songs were sung before they crossed the Danube? What gods watched over their forest altars, now lost beneath fields and cities? And how many stories remain unspoken, hidden in the soil, waiting to be found? The Slavs moved not with monuments, but with memory. And in their silence, the earth still echoes with questions. As the morning fog coils around the spires of a half-burned monastery, the cold wind sweeps across a land scarred by chaos. The rivers of Western Russia, once the lifelines of trade and faith, now carry the silence of abandonment. Villages lie in ruin. Fields rot, untouched. The bells of Moscow toll not in celebration, but in alarm. This was the time of troubles, Smutnoye Vremya, a chapter in Russian history as strange as it is violent. A time not merely of political collapse, but of something deeper, something more elusive, a rupture in reality itself. Spanning roughly from 1598 to 1613, this era began with the death of Tsar Fyodor I, the last of the Rurik dynasty. His passing marked more than the end of a bloodline. It marked the unraveling of a world. The Russian state, already strained by famine and internal division, fractured. The sky darkened with omens, an unrelenting famine between 1601 and 1603 that claimed hundreds of thousands. Crops failed. Cannibalism was whispered about behind shuttered windows. The sun seemed weaker. The seasons confused. And with nature's silence came human noise, desperation, betrayal, and war. But how did a powerful realm fall so suddenly and descend into a maelstrom of pretenders, invasions, and spectral claims to the throne? The first false Dimitri appeared in 1604. Claiming to be the youngest son of Ivan the Terrible, long thought murdered in childhood, this mysterious figure emerged from Poland, speaking fluent Russian and carrying the demeanor of nobility. Thousands believed him. The Orthodox Church hesitated. The boyars, hungry for power, supported him. Even Tsarina Maria, the mother of the real Dmitri, reportedly confirmed his identity. But who was he, truly? Was he an escaped monk named Grigory Otrepiev, as the official story claims? A Polish puppet sent to sow discord? Or something stranger, an opportunist who tapped into a nation's collective guilt and longing? He entered Moscow in triumph. He married a Polish noblewoman. And within a year, he was dead, thrown from a window, his body desecrated, and his name cursed. Yet even this did not close the wound. Two more men would rise, both claiming to be Dmitri reborn. The second, false Dmitri, was said to wear a mask. He traveled with a band of mercenaries, his face known only in shadow. The third appeared further south, near Pskov, leading Cossacks and collecting followers. Each one was believed, at least by some. Each one fueled the chaos. But how could three separate men, over the course of just a few years, convince thousands they were a dead prince? Were these mere impersonators, or did the people want to believe? Was Russia's trauma so deep that it called its own ghost into being? Amid the confusion, foreign powers moved in. Polish forces occupied Moscow. The Swedes marched on Novgorod. The boyar class, once the spine of Russian nobility, fractured into factions, some seeking Polish crowns, others longing for order at any cost. For a brief time, the Russian throne sat empty, or worse, occupied by foreign hands. Then came the rumors, quiet, unsettling. Villagers whispered of churches desecrated not by soldiers, but by unseen forces. Monasteries struck by sudden fires, storms that came without wind. In letters and records, priests spoke of moral decay so deep it felt unnatural, as if the very land had turned against its people. And always the question remained, what curse had been loosed with the death of Feodor? Some scholars, looking through a modern lens, point to the eruption of Peru's Huayna Putina volcano in 1600 as the trigger for the famine. The eruption was massive, its ash cloud altering the global climate. Crop failures were recorded as far as China. But can atmospheric ash explain madness? Pretenders? The eerie recurrence of a dead boy's name? Others suggest that the time of troubles was the inevitable collapse of a fragile autocracy, overburdened by expansion, undercut by elite rivalry. But even this leaves much unexplained. The sheer surrealism of the age, three Dimitris, foreign kings in the Kremlin, boyars turning on their own, and a church seemingly adrift, feels more than political. It feels metaphysical. And perhaps that is why, even after order was restored with the election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613, the memory of the troubles lingered like a fever dream. Russia had survived, but it had changed. It had stared into something, an abyss of self-forgetting, a convulsion of identity. What does it mean when a nation forgets its rulers, believes its dead have returned, and invites foreign kings to sit on its throne? What shadow passed over Russia in those years, and why does it still echo in its literature, its folklore, its silence? The time of troubles left few monuments, but in the soul of a nation, the scar remains. And somewhere beneath the ashes of famine, fire, and fear, the truth may still lie waiting. Just north of Rome, nestled in the rolling hills of Tuscany, the land breathes with ancient silence. Olive groves now cover the ruins of forgotten cities. Stone tombs lie scattered across the landscape, half swallowed by earth, their entrances dark and cool, untouched for centuries. Inside, painted walls tell stories no living voice remembers, scenes of banquets, dancers, underworld journeys, and strange rituals frozen in faded reds and ochres. These are the remnants of the Etruscans, a people whose brilliance helped shape the rise of Rome, yet whose origin and disappearance remain cloaked in mystery. Before Rome became an empire, before Latin filled the streets of Italy, the Etruscans ruled this land. From the 8th to the 3rd century BC, they flourished in a confederation of city-states, Tarquinia, Veii, Clusium, each with its own government, but united by a shared culture, language, and faith. They built roads and aqueducts, developed advanced metallurgy, and traded with Greeks, Phoenicians, and Carthaginians. Their ships sailed the Tyrrhenian Sea. Their artisans carved delicate bronze mirrors, cast intricate jewelry, and painted elaborate frescoes. And yet, despite their sophistication, the Etruscans remain largely unknown. The Roman historian Livy wrote of their kings. Virgil placed them among the noble warriors of ancient Italy. But much of what we know, or think we know, comes not from their own words, but from those who replaced them. For while the Etruscans left behind temples, tombs, and treasure, their written language, though partially deciphered, remains stubbornly opaque. Why, after centuries of power and innovation, did their voice fade? Etruscan inscriptions appear on tombs, mirrors, and ceramic artifacts, written in a script adapted from Greek. And yet, the language is a linguistic isolate, not clearly related to any known Indo-European tongue. We can read the letters, but often not the meaning. It's as if the Etruscans are speaking to us from the other side of a wall, audible but unintelligible. Some mainstream scholars suggest the Etruscans descended from the Villanovan culture of Iron Age Italy, developing organically from local roots. Others, drawing on the writings of Herodotus, propose an Eastern origin, that they came by sea from Lydia in Asia Minor, fleeing famine or war, settling in Italy generations before Rome's founding. Still, others entertain a more speculative possibility, that the Etruscans were remnants of an even older, pre-Indo-European Mediterranean civilization, one that had long existed in the shadows of the Aegean world. Could they have been cultural survivors of the enigmatic sea peoples, or distant kin of the Minoans, displaced westward after the Bronze Age collapse? We may never know. But the material culture they left behind suggests a people both worldly and deeply spiritual. Etruscan religion was complex, filled with gods, omens, and sacred rituals. They believed in a fixed cosmic order, revealed through signs in nature. Diviners, known as haruspices, read the future in the entrails of sacrificed animals or the patterns of lightning. This deep fascination with fate and celestial messages later impressed the Romans, who absorbed many Etruscan religious practices into their own state cults. And then there are the tombs. Some of the most detailed records of Etruscan life come from the necropolises, entire cities of the dead carved into hillsides or built from stone. Inside, we find scenes of daily life and death, joy and mourning, dance and darkness. But one question persists. Why did a culture so invested in the afterlife vanish so completely? By the 4th century BC, the Etruscans were in decline. Pressured by external enemies, Celts from the north, Greeks from the south, and an increasingly ambitious Rome, they slowly lost territory. In 396 BC, the Roman conquest of Veii marked a turning point. Over the next 2 centuries, the Etruscan cities fell one by one. Some capitulated, others resisted, only to be absorbed. And yet, they did not disappear overnight. Their blood flowed into Rome. Etruscan engineers laid the foundations for the city's early infrastructure. Etruscan symbols, like the fasces, a bundle of rods representing authority, were adopted by Roman magistrates. Even Rome's earliest kings, according to tradition, were Etruscan. Still, their culture eroded. Their language ceased to be spoken. Their temples were rededicated to Roman gods. Their names faded from memory. And perhaps that is the most mysterious part. How does a civilization so entwined with the rise of one of history's greatest empires vanish so quietly? Were they silenced by force or by assimilation? Did they lose their identity, or did they choose to let it go? Even today, archaeologists continue to uncover new tombs and inscriptions. Each discovery adds a piece to the puzzle, but the core remains elusive. Who were the Etruscans truly? And what did they believe about the world, about death, about themselves? Perhaps one day a key will be found, a complete text, a bilingual inscription, a buried archive. Or perhaps, like the people themselves, their secrets will remain just out of reach. A civilization known not by its words, but by the silence it left behind. In the vast, wind-scoured basin of the Tarim Desert, where China's modern Xinjiang region meets the ancient roots of the Silk Road, the land is silent, dry, and blinding beneath the sun. Here, buried beneath layers of sand and time, archaeologists have uncovered something wholly unexpected: remarkably preserved mummies with pale skin, long limbs, and hair the color of fire. Dressed in woolen garments, woven in styles more reminiscent of Bronze Age Europe than Central Asia, they lie in wooden coffins carved with geometric patterns. These are the ancient Tocharians, an enigma in the heart of the East. Who were they? And how did a people with apparent European features and an Indo-European language come to settle in one of the most remote corners of Asia? The mystery begins with the mummies, some of which date back as far as 1800 BC. Found near sites like Xiaohe and Churchen, they are astonishingly well preserved thanks to the arid climate. The bodies are not embalmed, yet they lie undisturbed in their burial clothes, with boots, hats, and even cosmetics. Some are wrapped in wool cloaks and tartan-like textiles that seem to mirror the patterns once woven in the distant lands of the Celts or Scythians. And yet, these mummies predate those cultures by centuries. Later, in desert cities like Kucha and Turfan, documents would be found in a now extinct language known as Tocharian, an eastern branch of the Indo-European family, related not to nearby Chinese or Turkic languages, but to Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit. Two dialects have been identified, Tocharian A and Tocharian B, written in a version of the Brahmi script used across South Asia. The texts, dating from the 6th to 8th centuries AD, include Buddhist sutras, administrative records, and medical treatises. But by then, the Tocharians themselves were fading. What we know is fragmentary. The Tocharians were part of a mosaic of cultures that populated the Tarim Basin, trading, translating, and transmitting knowledge between East and West. They built temples, carved cave sanctuaries, and left behind vivid murals depicting their life and faith, often shown with distinctly European features, clad in flowing robes, surrounded by Buddhist iconography. Mainstream theories suggest that the Tocharians were the easternmost wave of Indo-European migrations, part of the Great Dispersal that shaped much of Eurasian prehistory. But how they ended up here, isolated in the deserts of far western China, remains uncertain. Most Indo-European groups moved westward, into Europe, Iran, and the Indian subcontinent. The Tocharians, it seems, moved the other way. Why? Some propose a slow, generational drift, a chain of pastoral communities moving steadily east over centuries. Others point to possible connections with the Afanasyevo culture of southern Siberia, known for its early Indo-European characteristics. But there is no definitive link. The Tocharians appear abruptly, fully formed, in one of the world's harshest environments, and then vanish just as mysteriously. What compelled them to settle here, between desert and mountain, thousands of miles from their linguistic relatives? Their culture, too, defies easy categorization. They embraced Buddhism, but their earlier beliefs remain elusive. Their art borrows from India and Persia, yet their language carries echoes of a much older European tongue. They traded with Chinese dynasties, yet retained their distinct identity for centuries. Some of their murals depict knights with swords, elaborate court scenes, and funerary processions more reminiscent of Greco-Roman or Scythian art than anything traditionally East Asian. Could they have carried forgotten mythologies across the steppes? Were they guardians of knowledge now lost, traditions that once flowed across a pan-Eurasian network, only to be severed by time? There are more speculative theories as well. Some suggest that the Tocharians were descendants of a prehistoric migration from the west, possibly related to ancient Anatolian or Aegean peoples, driven east by war or climate change. Others see in them the remnants of a civilization erased by the shifting sands of both geography and empire. Their disappearance coincides with the rise of Turkic powers in the region and the spread of Islam along the Silk Road. Within a few generations, the Tocharian language and identity had been erased, absorbed or replaced by new cultural tides. And yet, the mummies remain. Their faces serene, their clothing intact, their bodies curled as if merely sleeping. What do they remember that we have forgotten? What stories were spoken in their language, now unread and barely understood? And how did a people from the far reaches of the Indo-European world come to leave their mark at the very edge of China? The Tocharians challenge our assumptions about migration, identity, and memory. They are a riddle in the desert, half buried beneath salt and sand. And somewhere, perhaps, the wind still carries the whisper of their lost words. In the northern highlands of Ethiopia, where the red earth meets the sky in jagged silhouettes, a quiet city of stone still stands. Carved obelisks rise solemnly above the landscape, tall, monolithic, and impossibly precise. Some are over 70 feet high, adorned with intricate false doors and windows, as if imitating the homes of the living for the benefit of the dead. These are the stelae of Aksum, markers of a once mighty civilization whose influence stretched across seas and centuries, and yet whose decline remains wrapped in silence. The kingdom of Aksum was one of the great powers of the ancient world. At its height between the 1st and 7th centuries AD, it was an empire of traders, warriors, and scribes, a bridge between Africa, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Aksumite merchants dealt in ivory, gold, frankincense, and enslaved people, sending goods across the Red Sea to Rome, Persia, and India. Its coins, among the first in sub-Saharan Africa, bore the faces of kings and crosses of a newly embraced Christianity. Greek, Ge'ez, and South Arabian inscriptions flowed through its courts and markets. The empire was literate, cosmopolitan, and ambitious. And then, it faded. By the 8th century, Aksum had all but disappeared from international maps and texts. Its cities declined. Its port of Adulis, once a vibrant hub for Red Sea commerce, fell into obscurity. The great stelae, once testaments to royal power, toppled or were buried by time and earth. What happened? Mainstream historians point to several contributing factors. One was the rise of Islam. As Islamic caliphates spread rapidly through the Arabian Peninsula and along the Red Sea coast in the 7th century, trade networks shifted. New Muslim merchants favored ports under Islamic rule. Aksum, now a Christian kingdom in a region turning Islamic, was increasingly cut off from its former economic arteries. There is also evidence of environmental change. pollen records and sediment studies suggest a pattern of deforestation, soil exhaustion, and possibly climate fluctuation. If agricultural yields declined, the population may have moved inland, abandoning the lowland trade centers for more sustainable upland farming. Drought and overuse of land could have slowly choked the empire from within. Yet these explanations, while logical, don't fully account for the scale and speed of Aksum's retreat from global prominence. Some suggest internal instability played a role: succession crises, religious divisions, or civil unrest. Christianity, introduced in the 4th century under King Ezana, became deeply embedded in Aksumite identity. But could rival religious movements have fractured the state from within? The archaeological record is patchy, offering only scattered hints: churches reused as fortresses, sudden shifts in settlement patterns, sacred inscriptions abandoned mid-carving. Others turn to more speculative theories. One such theory centers on the mysterious relocation of the Aksumite capital. Sometime in the 7th or 8th century, the center of political life appears to have moved southward into the highlands, eventually giving rise to the Zagwe dynasty. But no royal edict, no inscription, no chronicle explains this move. Was it driven by necessity, ideology, or something more obscure? Was the heart of the kingdom voluntarily abandoned or lost to an unknown catastrophe? Then there are the legends, whispers from Ethiopian tradition that suggest a more deliberate concealment. Some tales speak of holy relics transported and hidden in the mountains, of a sacred charge entrusted to a new line of rulers. Could the fall of Aksum have been, in part, a retreat into secrecy? A cultural transformation masked as decline? And what of the stelae? Their purpose remains uncertain. Though often described as grave markers, many have no burial chambers beneath. Some are placed above empty pits or collapsed tunnels. Were they purely symbolic? Did they mark tombs now looted or relocated? Or did they serve a spiritual or cosmological role, aligning with the stars, channeling something older than memory? The inscriptions that do survive offer little clarity. They celebrate victories, kingship, and the favor of God. But they stop abruptly. There is no final proclamation, no lament for a fading empire. Today, the legacy of Aksum still echoes. Its language, Ge'ez, survives in the liturgy of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Its crosses are etched into stone chapels across the highlands, and its stories endure, layered into the cultural memory of Ethiopia. But the reasons behind its fall remain elusive. Why did one of the most advanced kingdoms of its time, connected to Rome, India, and Byzantium, withdraw into isolation? Why did its coinage, once used across the Red Sea, vanish from circulation? And what knowledge was lost when Aksum's scribes laid down their styluses and its stelae fell silent? The stones of Aksum still stand, and in their shadow, the mystery of a vanished empire lingers, quietly waiting to be heard. As the sun rises over the Central Asian steppe, it casts long golden shadows across the ruins of Samarkand. The silence here is broken only by the wind, dry, whispering, as if carrying fragments of forgotten voices. Among the crumbling walls and fading frescoes lie clues to a civilization once known not for conquest, but for connection. Traders, translators, artisans, and envoys. They were the Sogdians, the lifeblood of the Silk Road, who bridged empires from China to Byzantium. And yet today, they remain largely forgotten. Who were these people who carved their stories into the very arteries of Asia and then vanished without a sound? From the 6th century BC to the 11th century AD, the Sogdians flourished in what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Their cities, Samarkand, Bukhara, Panjikent, were vibrant centers of commerce and culture. They spoke an Eastern Iranian language, wrote in an alphabet derived from Aramaic, and practiced a range of religions: Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Manichaeism, and later Nestorian Christianity, testifying to their pluralistic and adaptive identity. But their greatest legacy was not carved in stone or written in scripture. It was movement. Sogdian merchants moved silk, horses, spices, and precious metals along the Silk Road. They traveled further than most traders of their time, establishing diasporic communities in Chinese cities like Chang'an and Luoyang, where they served as interpreters, artists, and middlemen between East and West. Their letters, discovered in a ruined watchtower near Dunhuang, speak of far-flung families, fluctuating prices, and the dangers of the road: bandits, political unrest, betrayal. These are not imperial chronicles. They are human records, fragments of a life lived in motion. But even as their networks grew, their political identity remained elusive. The Sogdians never built an empire of their own. They lived within larger powers, under the Achaemenids, the Kushans, the Hephthalites, the Turks, and later, the Arabs and Mongols. And yet, despite being ruled, they influenced deeply. Their language became the lingua franca of the Silk Road. Their scripts appeared on contracts, religious texts, and cave murals from Central Asia to northern China. How could a people without armies hold such sway across continents? Some historians propose that the Sogdians' power came not from conquest, but from trust. Their merchants, often traveling in extended kinship networks, negotiated cultural boundaries with ease. They could adapt to local customs, learn new languages, and shift religious identities without losing their core. This cultural fluency made them indispensable to empires and essential to merchants, monks, and migrants alike. Still, for all their influence, their history has gaps. We have no great Sogdian chronicle, no national epic, no singular monument. Much of what we know comes from fragments, scattered manuscripts, buried coins, wall paintings preserved in dry cave cities like Panjikent, or foreign records that mention them in passing. It's as if they were always present, but always peripheral. Why? Perhaps their strength in multiplicity was also their vulnerability. Their cities were open, their beliefs diverse, their loyalties often pragmatic. When the Abbasid Caliphate rose in the 8th century, the Islamic world slowly absorbed the Sogdian trade routes. Arabic replaced Sogdian as the language of commerce. Their religious plurality became suspect in a world moving toward doctrinal unity, and in time, their identity dissolved, replaced by new powers, new languages, and new faiths. But there are lingering questions. Why, after centuries of prominence, did they leave behind so few records of themselves? Was this humility, or a deliberate choice? Could the Sogdians have preserved knowledge now lost, encoded in documents yet to be found beneath the desert sands? Some scholars suggest that the Sogdians were not merely traders, but keepers of ancient traditions, carriers of spiritual texts, oral histories, and forgotten cosmologies. In the Buddhist caves of Dunhuang, Sogdian scribes appear alongside Chinese, Tibetan, and Sanskrit monks. In Manichaean texts found in Western China, Sogdian is the preferred language of the faithful. Their artistic motifs, celestial dancers, sacred trees, winged figures, hint at mythologies we no longer fully understand. Were they intermediaries, not just of goods, but of belief? And then, there are the frescoes of Panjikent. Bright, vivid, and expressive, they depict scenes of banquet and battle, of gods and demons, of daily life and epic fantasy. Some resemble Persian epics, others Indian cosmologies. A few remain entirely unique. Who were these figures, painted on plaster so many centuries ago? Were they heroes of forgotten tales, or echoes of a mythic past that stretched far beyond the reach of Rome or China. The Sogdians remain a paradox, central to history, yet written at its margins. They shaped the Silk Road, yet left no stone monument in their own name. They spoke a language now dead, yet once known from Antioch to Xi'an. What else might lie beneath the ruins of Samarkand, hidden in the crevices of trade tunnels or the folds of ancient scrolls? What might we learn if we could hear their voices again, not through the writings of others, but in their own words? The winds of Central Asia still pass over the bones of Sogdian cities, and somewhere in that shifting dust, their story waits, unfinished. Carved into the rose-red cliffs of southern Jordan, the facade of Al-Khazneh, known as the Treasury, glows in the shifting desert light. Its towering columns and intricate details seem almost impossible, as though they were sculpted not by human hands, but by the mountain itself. For centuries, this monumental structure lay hidden, guarded by the sands and the silence of time. It is the face of Petra, the ancient capital of the Nabataeans, a people once powerful, sophisticated, and far-reaching, and now largely forgotten. Who were the Nabataeans, and how did they master the unforgiving desert only to vanish so completely? What we do know is that the Nabataeans were a nomadic Arab people who, by the 4th century BC, had begun to settle and thrive in the arid landscapes of the Levant. From modest caravan stations, they built a commercial empire that stretched from the Arabian Peninsula to Damascus, from Gaza to the Persian Gulf. At the height of their influence, their territory formed a crucial artery of trade connecting the East and the West. They were merchants of incense, myrrh, frankincense, spices, silk, and precious stones. But more than traders, they were engineers of astonishing skill. In a region where water is scarce, the Nabataeans developed an elaborate system of dams, aqueducts, and cisterns. They channeled flash floods into hidden reservoirs, storing enough water to sustain cities carved directly into rock. Petra, in particular, was not just a city. It was an oasis civilization, hidden in plain sight, blooming from the sandstone. And yet, for all their innovation, the Nabataeans remain shrouded in mystery. They left behind no extensive historical records. Their script, derived from the Aramaic alphabet, survives mainly in brief inscriptions, on tombs, monuments, and pottery. They had no great historian, no archive, no surviving literature. Most of what we know comes from outsiders, the Greeks, the Romans, and later, the Byzantines. These sources admired the Nabataeans' wealth and ingenuity, but they could not, or did not, capture the soul of the people themselves. Why did such a highly developed culture not preserve its own narrative? Was it lost, or never written? Even their religion is obscure. The Nabataeans worshipped a pantheon of deities, blending indigenous Arab beliefs with Hellenistic and Mesopotamian influences. Chief among them was Dushara, a god often represented as a black stone or uncarved block, aniconic, abstract, and enigmatic. They also venerated the goddess Al-Uzza, sometimes identified with Aphrodite or Isis. Many of their temples were hewn from living rock, their altars placed beneath the open sky. Was this a theology of nature, rooted in the rawness of desert life? Or does it hint at something more ancient, perhaps an inherited tradition from an even older, undocumented culture? Speculation grows deeper when considering Petra itself. The city's architectural style is a fusion of many worlds, Egyptian, Assyrian, Hellenistic, Roman, yet somehow wholly Nabataean. The facades of tombs and temples reflect a people who borrowed and blended without ever being overtaken. Some scholars argue that this cultural adaptability was a deliberate strategy, to appear familiar to traders and emissaries from every corner of the known world, while preserving a deeper, more hidden identity within. Others suggest Petra was not merely a city, but a sacred landscape, aligned with celestial bodies, designed with ritual as well as function in mind. Certain structures, including Al-Khazne and the monastery, appear to mark solstices and equinoxes with precision. Was Petra also an observatory, a calendar inscribed in stone? And if so, who taught the Nabataeans to read the stars? By the 2nd century AD, the Nabataean kingdom was annexed by Rome, and with surprising quiet, their distinct culture began to fade. Roman rule did not violently erase them. There was no great war, no mass conquest, but slowly, subtly, the Nabataeans disappeared from the written record. Their language gave way to Greek and Latin. Their religion was absorbed into new faiths. Their cities were repopulated, renamed, and eventually abandoned. Did they assimilate willingly, their identity diluted through commerce and diplomacy? Or was their silence the result of deeper pressures, economic decline, shifting trade routes, ecological strain? There are even stranger theories. Some suggest that the Nabataeans were heirs to a forgotten Bronze Age people, perhaps tied to the elusive Midianites or other nomadic tribes mentioned in biblical and regional texts. Others wonder if Petra was built atop an even older sacred site, its foundations predating the Nabataeans themselves, layered with meanings we no longer recognize. And what of the knowledge they took with them? What skills, ideas, or stories vanished when their temples emptied and their trade caravans ceased to roam? Today, the Nabataeans are remembered primarily through stone, monuments without words, carved with a precision that still defies explanation. Petra remains one of the world's great wonders, and yet its creators remain almost anonymous. What kind of people leave behind cities, but not stories? Civil engineering marvels, but no written treatises? Faces carved into cliffs, but no names to match them? Perhaps the Nabataeans never truly disappeared. Perhaps their knowledge lives on in unmarked ways, encoded in architecture, in local legends, in the quiet rhythm of desert water. But until the stones speak, their history remains a question, etched into sandstone, waiting. Along the shores of modern-day Tunisia, where the Mediterranean laps quietly against golden sands, lie the fragments of what was once Carthage, an empire of seafarers, merchants, and warriors. Today, scattered stones and sun-bleached ruins offer only a faint echo of its grandeur. Beneath layers of earth and centuries of silence, a deeper loss lingers, not just of walls and cities, but of memory itself. Carthage, the city founded by Phoenician settlers in the 9th century BC, rose to become one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world. Its influence stretched across North Africa, into Spain, across Sicily, and beyond. It rivaled Rome in wealth, in strategy, in endurance. And yet, while Rome wrote its legacy in marble and text, Carthage left behind a different kind of silence. Because most of what we know about Carthage comes not from the Carthaginians themselves, but from their enemies. When Rome finally defeated Carthage in 146 BC, at the end of the Third Punic War, it did so with brutal finality. The city was sacked, its population killed or enslaved, its buildings razed. The Roman historian Appian claimed that Carthage was set ablaze for 17 days, that its land was sown with salt, a likely myth, yet one that reflects the psychological magnitude of the destruction. But amid this vengeance, something even more profound was lost, nearly the entire written record of Carthaginian civilization. What knowledge vanished in those flames? Carthage was no illiterate kingdom. Its roots were Phoenician, a culture famed for the invention of the alphabet and maritime trade networks that circled the ancient Mediterranean. Carthaginian scribes inscribed treaties, ledgers, prayers, and laws in the Punic script, a variant of Phoenician, on papyrus, parchment, and stone. The city had libraries, temple archives, and administrative texts. Their philosophers wrote treatises. Their navigators kept records of exploration and commerce. Hanno, the navigator, for instance, is said to have sailed far along the coast of Africa, leaving behind a detailed account, a single surviving fragment of what was likely a much broader tradition. But nearly all of it is gone. Some Roman authors, such as Pliny the Elder, hinted at the richness of Carthaginian knowledge. Pliny mentions that a vast collection of Carthaginian agricultural writings was translated into Latin by order of the Roman Senate, including the works of Mago, a Carthaginian agronomist whose 28-volume manual became a foundation for Roman farming techniques. Yet, Mago's original Punic text, like so many others, has been lost, known only through second-hand Latin adaptations or vague references. What happened to the rest? One theory holds that the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC included the systematic eradication of its intellectual and religious heritage. Whether out of practical necessity or ideological intent, the archives were not preserved. The temples, which likely held the most sacred texts, were demolished. The royal records, if they existed, were incinerated. The language itself, Punic, was gradually suppressed, and within a few centuries, it had vanished from daily use. Others argue that the knowledge may have been dispersed. Some Carthaginian refugees fled inland or to other Phoenician colonies. Could fragments of Punic history have survived in private hands or distant libraries? Some Punic inscriptions have been found as far away as Sardinia and Sicily. A few bilingual stelae, written in Punic and Greek or Latin, offer tantalizing glimpses into lost rituals and titles. But these are mere slivers. Speculation deepens when we consider what might have been in those lost scrolls. Did the Carthaginians possess ancient maritime charts, perhaps even records of transatlantic navigation, as some fringe theorists suggest? Could their libraries have preserved Phoenician wisdom from Tyre and Sidon, now irretrievably lost? What theological concepts were held within the temples of Tanit and Baal Hammon? We know they practiced a complex and now controversial religion, but our understanding is filtered almost entirely through Roman and Greek sources, hostile voices that painted the Carthaginians as brutal and barbaric. Were those accounts exaggerated? Some historians now believe that Roman descriptions of Carthaginian child sacrifice, for example, were politically motivated, designed to justify conquest by portraying the enemy as morally depraved. Recent archaeological studies of Taphets, Carthaginian burial sites, reveal a more nuanced picture, but without Carthage's own writings, the truth remains out of reach. What did the Carthaginians truly believe? How did they see themselves, not as the enemy, but as heirs to a Phoenician legacy, as innovators, as explorers? The destruction of Carthage's records did more than erase a city. It removed a voice from history. It is a silence that invites questions. Why did Rome not preserve more of Carthage's texts, as it had with Greece? Was this destruction a calculated act of cultural obliteration, an attempt to dominate not only the body, but the mind of a people? Or was it an accident of war and time, fueled by flame and forgotten by chance? Some still hope that buried caches may yet be discovered, sealed urns beneath temple ruins, forgotten scrolls in distant sanctuaries. The dry climate of North Africa might have preserved more than we think. Perhaps a future excavation will reveal a library, intact, waiting patiently beneath layers of ash and rubble. Until then, we are left with ruins, Roman commentary, and the enduring question: what was Carthage, in its own words? The answer may never come. But the silence itself remains one of the most haunting absences in the history of the ancient world. In the dim light of a stone courtyard, smoke rose in slow spirals into the highland sky. The fire cracked, feeding on a strange fuel. Not wood, but bark-covered scrolls and long, folded books, painted with vibrant figures, intricate glyphs, and symbols no Spaniard could understand. In 1562, in the heart of the Yucatan Peninsula, Fray Diego de Landa watched as centuries, perhaps millennia, of recorded thought turned to ash. This was not the destruction of buildings or statues. It was the erasure of memory. The codices, painted books made from the inner bark of fig trees, were the lifeblood of Mesoamerican civilization. The Maya, the Mixtec, the Aztec, and others used them to record astronomy, history, rituals, medicine, genealogy, and prophecy. They folded like accordion fans, filled with colors still brilliant today where they survive, and they were read not in lines, but in flows, woven from glyph and image, spirit and number. But only a handful remain. Out of what may have been thousands of codices across Mesoamerica, fewer than 20 survive today, some mere fragments. Of those, only 4 are undisputedly Maya. The rest were burned, either in public acts of destruction or quietly, piece by piece, as priests and conquistadors sought to wipe away the religious and intellectual traditions of the pagan world they were conquering. Why? The Spanish conquest of the Americas was more than a military campaign. It was also a spiritual one. The Catholic Church saw itself as saving souls from false gods, and in the written traditions of the indigenous peoples, it saw dangerous remnants of a sophisticated cosmology, one that refused to die quietly. To many friars, these books were not just documents, they were living links to the devil. The codices spoke of deities, blood offerings, sacred calendars, and ancestral wisdom that had no place in Christian Europe's worldview. Fray de Landa, one of the most notorious figures in this story, wrote in his own words, "We found a large number of books, and since they contain nothing but superstitions and lies of the devil, we burned them all." Yet he would later attempt to reconstruct the very language he had tried to destroy. In his Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, he included a partial alphabet of Maya glyphs, an effort to understand what had already been lost. But this alphabet was flawed, a misunderstanding of a complex logosyllabic script. Still, centuries later, it became a key to deciphering what remained. And what remains is hauntingly little. What knowledge was lost in the flames? The Maya had a calendar more accurate than the Julian. Their astronomers tracked Venus and lunar eclipses with astonishing precision. Their historical records stretched back centuries, possibly to mythic ages. Their medicine incorporated herbs and techniques unknown in Europe at the time, and their rituals, woven into seasonal cycles, architecture, and lineage, formed a worldview both intricate and deeply human. Could the codices have contained philosophies now erased? Maps to sacred sites never rediscovered? Records of natural phenomena, eclipses, droughts, plagues that might rewrite our understanding of pre-Columbian history? Some speculate that the codices held even more than science and myth, that they recorded migrations, encoded lost cities, or preserved oral traditions from civilizations even older than the Maya. Others wonder whether some surviving codices remain hidden, kept in secret by indigenous families for generations, buried with priests, or locked in the archives of European libraries under misidentified catalogs. Indeed, several codices did survive, but barely. The Dresden Codex, now in Germany, narrowly escaped destruction. Its vivid astronomical charts and ritual tables were once used to predict eclipses and agricultural cycles. The Madrid Codex, rediscovered in the 19th century, lay unnoticed in a Spanish museum. The Paris Codex sat forgotten in the Bibliothèque Nationale for centuries. Each of these is a window into a lost world, but each is just one chapter in a library that once numbered in the thousands. Even the Aztec, whose codices were created later and often in collaboration with Spanish scribes, saw their works vanish. The Codex Mendoza, created for the Spanish crown, was lost at sea and later recovered. Other documents, like the Florentine Codex compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún, survive only because they were filtered through European hands. But what of the originals, the ones not translated or redrawn? What truths were deemed too dangerous to survive? Some modern researchers believe that the loss of these texts did more than sever history. It fractured identity. Without written records, many indigenous communities were forced to rely solely on oral tradition, vulnerable to colonial reinterpretation. Cultural memory became fragmented. Languages began to disappear, and with them, the frameworks through which entire civilizations understood themselves and the cosmos. Was this destruction intentional cultural genocide, or the tragic byproduct of spiritual conquest? Did the Spanish truly understand what they were burning? And how many voices remain locked in silence, their stories reduced to ash, their meaning waiting in symbols carved in stone or buried beneath the forest floor? The smoke of the burning codices has long since vanished into the sky, but the loss still hangs in the air, quiet, irreversible, and deeply unfinished. And somewhere, perhaps, in a hidden vault or an untouched cave, one final codex waits to speak again. In the heart of Bihar, India, beneath the haze of morning mist and the faint scent of sandalwood drifting through the plains, lie the silent ruins of what was once the greatest seat of learning in the ancient world, Nalanda. Red brick stupas and crumbling monasteries stretch across the land, scattered like the last breaths of a civilization's vast and vanished intellect. The stone walkways, now walked by birds and wind, once echoed with the steps of scholars, pilgrims, and monks. Here, knowledge was not merely studied, it was lived, shared, and preserved. And then, it was burned. Nalanda University, founded in the 5th century AD, was more than a center of Buddhist philosophy. It was a thriving, international university centuries before Europe's oldest institutions were born. Students came from China, Tibet, Korea, Sri Lanka, and beyond. Its library was said to house hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, texts on logic, medicine, astronomy, grammar, metaphysics, mathematics, and the Buddhist Dharma in all its forms. According to travelers like Xuanzang and Yijing, Nalanda was a place of profound rigor and spiritual depth. Its scholars debated openly, translated texts across languages, and preserved the fragile lineage of ancient thought. But in the 12th century, that legacy was reduced to ash. The widely accepted narrative tells of Bakhtiar Khilji, a military commander of the Ghurid dynasty, who swept through northern India in the late 1100s. As part of his campaign, he is believed to have attacked Nalanda, seeing it not as a sanctuary of learning, but as a symbol of resistance and power. The accounts suggest the libraries were set alight, the monks slaughtered, and the buildings left in ruin. According to later sources, the fires that consumed Nalanda's manuscripts burned for days, some say for months. But as with many such historical events, the truth lies somewhere between record and rumor. No contemporary Muslim source mentions the burning of Nalanda by name. Much of the story comes from later chronicles, written decades or even centuries after the fact, accounts like those of Minhaj-i-Siraj or Persian writings that conflate multiple universities or events. Archaeological evidence confirms the destruction of Nalanda's structures during this period, but the cause, scale, and specific identity of the attacker remain points of debate. Was Khilji acting on religious fanaticism? Was the destruction strategic, targeting a stronghold of cultural influence during a time of military expansion? Or was it the tragic consequence of broader social upheaval, with Nalanda simply caught in the path of a shifting empire. And what exactly was lost in the flames? This question may never be fully answered. The library at Nalanda was said to consist of three main buildings: Ratnasagara, Ratnodadi, and Ratnaranjaka, names that mean Ocean of Jewels, Sea of Jewels, and Delight of Jewels. Within these towers, thousands of palm leaf and birch bark manuscripts were catalogued and protected. These were not only sacred Buddhist texts, but treatises on medicine, chemistry, engineering, architecture, linguistics, and metaphysics, many of which may have existed nowhere else. What if these texts contained scientific theories centuries ahead of their time? What if commentaries on lost philosophies, Vedantic, Jain, or Buddhist, lay within those volumes, now gone? And more haunting still, how much of India's ancient intellectual lineage was erased with that single act? Some suggest that copies of key manuscripts survived, preserved in Tibet and China. It is true that Chinese scholars like Xuanzang had already translated many works during their pilgrimages to Nalanda, but those were selections, not a complete archive. Others believe that some manuscripts may still lie buried in the surrounding regions, awaiting discovery, sealed in underground chambers or hidden in monasteries that escaped the fires. There are also those who question whether Nalanda truly died that day. Historical records hint that Nalanda may have continued to function in a diminished capacity for decades after the attack. Some Buddhist institutions adapted, moved, or merged with others. Yet the aura of Nalanda, the idea of it as the crown of an intellectual golden age, was undeniably broken. It would never again attract students in the thousands. The fire had done more than destroy books. It had severed the thread of cultural continuity. In this loss, there is a peculiar silence. No detailed inventory of the destroyed library survives. No list of names, no catalog. The thoughts, voices, and visions of centuries were not merely lost. They were uncounted. Was this a deliberate forgetting? Did the invaders seek to erase not just texts, but the very idea of the world they came from, a cosmos built not on conquest, but on contemplation? Or is the tragedy of Nalanda more universal, a reminder of how fragile knowledge truly is, how easy it is for the accumulated wisdom of generations to vanish in a single spark? Today, as the wind moves through Nalanda's ruins, it carries a stillness both sacred and sorrowful. The remnants of its stone walls bear no inscriptions of what once filled its libraries. The echoes of its halls, once alive with debate and learning, now hold only birdsong and breath. And yet, beneath the soil, in undiscovered caches or distant monasteries, could fragments still remain? Could the knowledge of Nalanda, burned but not extinguished, still find a way to speak? Perhaps some stories, though silenced, have not yet finished being told. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of Europe's medieval monasteries, behind the worn bindings of illuminated manuscripts, and under layers of dust on crumbling cathedral stones, there are traces, faint, fragmented, of lives once lived and voices long silenced. Some appear in marginal notes scribbled in Latin. Others are embedded in the folds of faded textiles or etched into forgotten tombs. But look closely, and a pattern begins to emerge. Names missing, deeds unrecorded, stories half told. This is not merely a case of lost history. It is a story of deliberate omission, a quiet erasure of women from the medieval record. What was taken, and why? The medieval world was not, contrary to modern assumptions, a monolith of male dominance. Women were scribes, physicians, landowners, abbesses, philosophers, queens, poets, mystics. They led armies, authored texts, taught theology. In the early Middle Ages, before rigid institutional structures took hold, many women moved with surprising agency through the spiritual and intellectual currents of their time. but much of their legacy has vanished. Take, for instance, the case of the female scribes. At several monastic sites, particularly in the Germanic world, archaeological evidence has revealed that women not only copied sacred texts, but illuminated them. A recent study discovered microscopic traces of lapis lazuli, a rare and expensive blue pigment, in the dental calculus of a woman buried in an 11th century convent in Germany. She had no surviving name, but the presence of the pigment suggests she was an artist, licking the tip of her brush to perfect her work. Her presence was never recorded in the manuscript she helped to create. How many such women labored in silence, anonymous even in the margins? Or consider Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century mystic, writer, composer, and visionary. Her theological writings and compositions were so prolific, so revolutionary, that she was canonized centuries later. But even Hildegard's name was nearly lost. Her works attributed to men, dismissed as mystical exaggeration, or confined to cloistered study for centuries. Were hers the exceptional stories that survived, or merely the tip of a vast and submerged tradition? In royal courts, too, women played crucial roles, as advisors, diplomats, and strategists. Empress Theophanu, the Byzantine-born wife of Otto II, effectively ruled the Holy Roman Empire during her son's minority. Her influence on art, politics, and religious policy shaped an entire generation. Yet, she is rarely named outside specialist texts. What of the queens who governed, the regents who brokered peace, the noblewomen who held estates and commanded troops in the absence of their husbands? Why do the chronicles so often reduce them to wives, daughters, consorts, never agents in their own right? Part of the answer lies in the gatekeepers of historical memory. For centuries, history was recorded primarily by men, monks, court scribes, clerics, whose perspectives reflected the values and structures of their institutions. What did not fit within those frameworks was often ignored, minimized, or reattributed. Women's achievements were sometimes credited to their male relatives or spiritual mentors. Their names might be altered, Latinized, or dropped altogether in translations and copies. And then there's the matter of destruction. As religious and political shifts swept through Europe, Reformation, Revolution, centralization, archives were purged, monasteries dissolved, libraries burned. Manuscripts that centered on female saints, female mystics, or even female genealogies were more likely to be discarded as irrelevant, heretical, or outdated. Some were deliberately destroyed, others simply neglected until they crumbled to dust. How many books by women lie disintegrated in monastic cellars? How many songs, prayers, scientific treatises, and letters have been lost because they bore the wrong author's name? More speculative theories suggest even deeper silences. Some researchers propose that entire traditions of female healing and spiritual practice were absorbed into folklore and dismissed as superstition. The figure of the wise woman, the herbalist, the midwife, once respected in her village, was gradually demonized. By the time of the witch trials, centuries later, the accumulated knowledge of countless generations of women had been reframed as dangerous, heretical, or evil. Could this represent not only a loss of individuals, but a systematic dismantling of parallel knowledge systems, ones rooted in lived experience, in the rhythms of the body and the land? There are even scholars who argue that certain surviving texts, now attributed to male authors, may have originally been written by women. The medieval practice of recopying texts often allowed scribes to erase or replace names. Could some of our canonical works hide unfamiliar hands behind familiar signatures? And then there are the physical silences, the graves without names, the statues defaced, the monastery records with entries blotted out. Not all erasure happens in ink. Still, hope remains. In the last few decades, new methods, paleography, digital restoration, isotope analysis, have begun to shed light on the missing half of history. Fragments are being reassembled. Anonymous hands are being matched to specific schools or workshops. Some of the erased are being named again, but much remains hidden. Why were so many women removed from the record, even when they left behind works, deeds, and names? Was it a slow erosion of memory, or a conscious rewriting of the past? And how many voices are still waiting in the margins, in palimpsests, in footnotes, in dusty vaults, to be heard once more? The medieval world was not empty of women's minds, hands, or words, but the silence that follows them. That silence still speaks volumes. In the heart of ancient Baghdad, where the Tigris River once glimmered with the lantern light of scholars burning oil into the night, there stood a library unlike any the world had ever known. The Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, was more than a repository of scrolls. It was a crucible of intellect, a sanctuary of translation, debate, discovery. Within its walls, languages intertwined: Greek, Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, all converged in quiet harmony. Astronomers calculated the movements of distant stars. Mathematicians unlocked the secrets of algebra. Philosophers walked in the shadow of Aristotle and Plotinus, reinterpreted through the lens of a new world. And then, it was gone. The destruction of the House of Wisdom remains one of history's most enduring cultural tragedies. It is often dated to the year 1258 AD, when Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan laid siege to Baghdad, then the flourishing heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. For 7 days, the city was ravaged. Palaces were looted, mosques burned, and the library, along with its countless volumes, was cast into the river. According to surviving accounts, the Tigris ran black with ink for days. But how much of this is historical record, and how much is legend? The House of Wisdom had been established in the 9th century under Caliph Harun al-Rashid and his son al-Ma'mun. Modeled in part after earlier Persian and Hellenistic institutions, it quickly grew into a center of learning that attracted thinkers from across the known world. It was here that the works of Plato and Galen were translated into Arabic, often alongside original commentaries that advanced the knowledge far beyond its classical origins. Here, scholars refined trigonometry, developed algorithms, charted celestial bodies, debated metaphysics, and recorded the complex geometry of the heavens. It was not a library in the modern sense. It was a living organism, a school, a workshop, a gathering of minds. And its destruction was not merely a loss of paper and ink, it was the silencing of centuries. Yet the specifics of that destruction remain elusive. Did the Mongols truly destroy the House of Wisdom? Some historians now question whether the library still existed in the form described by medieval chroniclers by the time of Hulagu's siege. Baghdad had suffered political and intellectual decline for decades before the invasion. The House of Wisdom may already have been diminished, its scholars dispersed, its collections fragmented or relocated. Others suggest the ink-darkened river may be poetic exaggeration, an image meant to symbolize cultural devastation rather than literal fact. The primary source of the story, the Syrian Christian chronicler Bar Hebraeus, wrote years after the event. No eyewitness from within Baghdad describes the drowning of books in quite such terms, and yet the legend persists. Why? Perhaps because it captures something deeper than historical precision. Whether the books were truly thrown into the river or not, there is no doubt that the Mongol conquest shattered the intellectual infrastructure of the Abbasid world. Thousands died. The caliph was executed. The city's leading scholars were scattered or slain. The institutional memory of the House of Wisdom, its networks, its patrons, its physical manuscripts, disappeared almost overnight. What knowledge perished in that silence? We may never know. The records of the House of Wisdom were vast and wide-ranging. Among its treasures were translations of Greek natural philosophy, treatises on Indian mathematics, original texts on optics and chemistry, anatomical diagrams, star charts, medical encyclopedias, and rare ancient histories now lost to time. Some scholars believe the earliest recorded use of the scientific method was practiced there. Others suggest that key innovations in engineering and navigation may have emerged from its halls. Could the library have preserved books from even older civilizations, works from Alexandria, from Persia, from Babylon itself? And were copies made, hidden perhaps in distant cities like Nishapur, Damascus, or Cordoba? Could fragments still survive in private collections or buried archives, unrecognized or unread? Speculative theories extend further. Some propose that the Mongol destruction was not merely an accident of war, but a strategic cultural decapitation, an effort to neutralize Baghdad not only as a political power, but as an intellectual beacon. Others see in the loss of the House of Wisdom a warning that knowledge, however vast, is fragile when dependent on place and power. And yet, despite the devastation, echoes remain. The Arabic translations produced at the House of Wisdom traveled far beyond Baghdad, forming the foundation for later Islamic scholarship and eventually the European Renaissance. The works of Avicenna, Al-Hazan, Al-Khwarizmi, names shaped by the house, lived on in Latin manuscripts, studied by scholars from Bologna to Oxford. But these were only the visible survivors. What of the rest? The vanished texts, the unnamed thinkers, the ideas that were never passed on? What understanding of the natural world, of history, of mathematics or metaphysics might have been lost forever? Today, as we walk through the ruins of old Baghdad or run our fingers over faded Arabic manuscripts, we feel not only the passage of time, but the weight of absence. An absence measured not in what we know, but in what we can no longer even ask. The House of Wisdom was not merely destroyed, it was forgotten. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all. What might we remember if the river had not run black? And what might still be waiting, in silence, to be found again? As morning fog drifts through the mountain passes of central China, veiling the ruins of old fortifications and long-forgotten roads, it is easy to forget that this landscape was once the heart of a world-shaking upheaval. A rebellion so vast, so sudden, and so devastating that it nearly unraveled one of the greatest empires in human history. This was the An Lushan Rebellion, a conflict that began with a single ambitious general and ended with a death toll so staggering that it still defies comprehension. But what truly happened during those dark years? And why does the full story remain so elusive? The Tang dynasty in the 8th century AD stood at the height of its power. Its capital, Chang'an, today's Xi'an, was the largest and most cosmopolitan city on earth, a glowing center of art, science, trade, and culture. Foreign merchants filled its markets. Buddhist temples, Taoist shrines, and Confucian schools coexisted in uneasy harmony. The Silk Road pulsed with goods and ideas flowing in and out of China. Under Emperor Xuanzong, the dynasty seemed invincible. But beneath the surface, cracks had begun to form. The military system had shifted from a citizen-soldier model to one reliant on regional commanders, jiedushi, who governed large swaths of territory with increasing autonomy. These generals commanded private armies, collected their own taxes, and held immense power, often dwarfing that of the central government. Among them was An Lushan, a general of Sogdian and Gukturk descent, charismatic, cunning, and deeply embedded in the court through his relationship with the emperor and his favorite concubine, Yang Guifei. In 755 AD, An Lushan launched a rebellion. Marching his troops from the northeast, he seized the capital with shocking speed. What followed was nearly a decade of chaos, a civil war that shattered the illusion of Tang supremacy, depopulated entire regions, and left cities burned, temples looted, and millions dead. Some modern estimates place the death toll as high as 30 to 40 million, one of the deadliest conflicts in all of human history. But how did it all happen so quickly? Historians point to systemic weaknesses, corruption, imperial indulgence, and the overdependence on frontier generals. The court had grown distant, bloated with intrigue. The emperor himself, once wise and diligent, had become increasingly disengaged. Yet others see something more profound, a kind of civilizational breaking point, when the very weight of the empire's own complexity turned against it. Why did so many soldiers follow An Lushan? Was it simple loyalty, ethnic solidarity, or were there deeper fractures within Tang society that made rebellion seem not only possible, but inevitable? The rebellion itself was not a single, clean war. It fractured into layers, rival warlords, opportunistic uprisings, shifting alliances. An Lushan declared himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Yan, but was assassinated by his own son within 2 years. The rebellion did not end with his death. In fact, it spread, evolving into a brutal, slow-burning collapse that hollowed out the empire from within. The toll on the population was catastrophic. Cities were emptied, irrigation systems fell into disrepair, famine and plague followed in the wake of battle. Cultural flourishing gave way to silence. The Tang court, eventually re-established in a diminished form, never fully recovered. The dynasty limped on for another century, but the Golden Age was over. And yet, despite its scale, the An Lushan Rebellion remains strangely underrepresented in global historical consciousness. Why? Some believe it's because of the way Chinese historiography frames collapse as a cyclical inevitability rather than a singular catastrophe. Others point to the political sensitivity of discussing ethnic tensions, or the romanticized narrative surrounding Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei, a tale of tragic love overshadowing deeper systemic failure. But some questions go further still. Did the rebellion mark the beginning of a much longer transformation, one in which China's imperial center permanently shifted in both spirit and substance? Did it sow the seeds for the later fragmentation of the empire, the rise of regional powers, and the long-term weakening of centralized Confucian order? More speculative theories suggest that the rebellion may have disrupted more than just politics. Some point to abrupt interruptions in astronomical records, mathematical treatises, and poetry collections, cultural silences that hint at knowledge lost or deliberately buried. Could it be that archives were destroyed? That scrolls, maps, or instruments vanished during the sieges? That something more than administration and art was lost? And what of An Lushan himself? Was he a traitor, a rebel, a usurper? Or was he, as some sources suggest, manipulated by court factions who saw him as a tool, until he turned against them? His mixed heritage, once a symbol of Tang cosmopolitanism, later became the scapegoat for explaining his ambition. But was his rise a symptom, not a cause, of a deeper unraveling? Today, little remains of the physical legacy of the An Lushan Rebellion. The cities have been rebuilt, the battlefields forgotten. The chronicles survive, but they are incomplete, colored by politics, and often retold through the lens of later dynasties seeking order over ambiguity. But the questions remain. How could a single rebellion bring a golden age to its knees? What truths have been lost amid the ashes of Chang'an and the ruined villages of the north? And how many more such stories lie hidden in the quiet corners of history, where glory ends and shadow begins? The empire survived, but something vital did not. and in that silence, the true cost of the rebellion may still be waiting to be heard. Beneath the ochre stones of Judea's hill country, where olive groves sway under a sun that has seen empires rise and fall, there are echoes of a forgotten revolution. Small mountain paths wind between ancient ruins, where wild herbs grow in the cracks of time-worn stones. It was in these rugged landscapes, neither fully desert nor truly settled, that a rebellion was born. A movement not only of swords and soldiers, but of belief, identity, and defiance. This was the time of the Maccabean Wars. But how much do we truly understand about what happened during those tumultuous years? And how much has been shaped by myth, memory, and silence? In the 2nd century BC, the Seleucid Empire stretched from Asia Minor to the borders of India. A Hellenistic dynasty founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, the Seleucids ruled over a patchwork of cultures, languages, and traditions. Among them was the Jewish population of Judea, a people who had long balanced local autonomy with foreign oversight. That balance broke under the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Accounts describe a period of forced Hellenization. Jewish religious practices were suppressed, circumcision was outlawed, and the temple in Jerusalem was desecrated, rededicated to Zeus, its altars used for pagan sacrifice. This wasn't simply political subjugation. It was seen as an assault on the sacred, a threat not just to a people's land, but to their very covenant with the divine. And then, something unexpected happened. A priest named Mattathias from the small town of Modane refused to offer sacrifice to the king's gods. According to tradition, he struck down the royal envoy and fled into the wilderness with his 5 sons. There, among caves and valleys, they rallied followers, farmers, zealots, priests. After Mattathias's death, his son Judah, called Maccabee, the Hammer, led a guerrilla uprising that would ignite a fire across the land. The Maccabean revolt, which began around 167 BC, was improbable from the start. A small force of rebels, poorly armed and vastly outnumbered, facing one of the most powerful militaries of the ancient world. And yet, they endured. Through hit-and-run tactics, night raids, and careful use of terrain, the Maccabees pushed back against Seleucid forces. Within 3 years, they had recaptured Jerusalem. In 164 BC, they cleansed the temple, removed the foreign idols, and rekindled the eternal flame. This act is commemorated in the Jewish festival of Hanukkah. But the story that follows, what came after the rededication, is less often told. The conflict didn't end with one victory. The Maccabean Wars continued for decades, as the Hasmoneans, as the ruling family came to be known, fought both Seleucid forces and internal rivals. Judea oscillated between autonomy and dependency, between priestly leadership and royal ambition. The line between freedom fighters and monarchs blurred. What began as a revolt for religious purity evolved into a complex dynastic struggle. Foreign alliances were forged, civil wars erupted, treaties were signed with the emerging power of Rome. Within a generation, the Maccabees had transformed from rebels into rulers. Was this the natural arc of revolution, or something else? Some scholars suggest that the later Hasmoneans, while claiming to uphold the traditions of their forebears, gradually adopted the very Hellenistic customs they once fought against. Coins bearing their images mimicked Greek designs. Political marriages crossed religious lines. Ritual authority was entangled with secular ambition. Did the Maccabees win only to become what they had once opposed? And what of the historical record itself? Our primary sources for the Maccabean Wars come from texts like 1 and 2 Maccabees, books preserved in the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, but not in the later Hebrew Bible. These texts are both detailed and deeply shaped by theological vision. They present the Maccabees as chosen instruments of divine justice. Miracles are described, Battles are recounted in vivid, triumphant terms. But what lies beneath the religious narrative? Other texts, such as the works of Josephus, writing centuries later, offer additional perspectives, but also raise questions. His accounts blend Roman influence, Jewish loyalty, and personal interpretation. And in the gaps between these sources, mystery remains. Why do we have so few independent records from the Seleucid side? Were documents lost, or were they never written? And deeper still, what cultural or philosophical ideas may have been suppressed during this time? What rival interpretations of the revolt were silenced when the Hasmoneans came to power? Were there other sects, voices, or visions of resistance that have simply vanished into the dust? Archaeology offers some tantalizing clues. Hidden fortresses have been uncovered in the Judean hills, stone walls hastily built, supply caches buried, signal fires long cold. Pottery shards and ritual objects speak of a people caught between war and worship. Inscriptions from later Hasmonean kings, once defaced or removed, are now being re-examined. Still, much remains unknown. Were the Maccabean Wars a sudden eruption, or the climax of years of building tension between tradition and assimilation? Did they mark a turning point in Jewish history, or a cyclical struggle repeated again and again across time? And why does the narrative that survives feel so complete, yet so strangely unfinished? The Maccabees became symbols of resistance, but history, as always, is more complicated than symbol, and somewhere between the blood-stained stones of the temple and the wind-worn cliffs of Judea, the full truth may still be waiting, quietly buried beneath the story we've been told. In the misty valleys of the German countryside, where rivers wind through low hills and the scent of damp soil lingers in the air, one can still find the remains of ruined villages and burned abbeys, quiet scars from a forgotten revolt. The fields that now lie tranquil were once trampled by tens of thousands of desperate feet. Beneath the cobbled streets of medieval market towns, echoes remain, of hymns sung in defiance, of slogans scrawled on parchment, of farmers gripping scythes not to harvest grain, but to claim justice. This was the German Peasants' War, a rising that swept across the Holy Roman Empire in a storm of hope, fury, and ultimately, silence. But what truly ignited this rebellion? And why has its deeper meaning faded into the margins of European memory? Between 1524 and 1525, a movement emerged, unexpected in its size, astonishing in its ambition. It began with local grievances: tithes too high, hunting rights revoked, land seized by nobles and abbots. For centuries, peasants had endured the burdens of serfdom, the crushing obligations of feudal law, and the unpredictable cruelty of lords, both secular and spiritual. But now, something had changed. The winds of Reformation were blowing. Martin Luther's theses had cracked open the religious order of Europe just years earlier. While Luther himself would eventually recoil from the rebellion, his writings had already shaken the foundations of authority. The Bible, he claimed, should be read by all. Salvation came not through hierarchy, but through faith. To the peasant, this was not just theological nuance, it was liberation. Why should a priest own land while a farmer starved? Why should a noble hunt deer in forests where a laborer could not gather firewood? If all men were equal before God, what gave one man the right to rule another? In pamphlets and sermons, ideas spread. In taverns and churches, alliances formed. A document known as the 12 Articles emerged, clear, articulate, and revolutionary. It demanded an end to serfdom, fair treatment from lords, and the right for communities to choose their own pastors. It was not wild or anarchic. It was a plea for justice, drawn, the authors claimed, from Scripture. And yet the response was swift and brutal. At its height, The revolt involved over 300,000 peasants across southern and central Germany. They seized castles, stormed monasteries, and formed armed bands under charismatic leaders like Thomas Münzer, a former priest who preached a fiery gospel of divine judgment against the unjust. Münzer called for the violent overthrow of the godless, urging peasants to take up the sword as agents of divine will. But the rebellion was fragmented. Some groups fought under banners of Christian reform. Others simply demanded food. Some formed councils. Others looted. The nobility, at first stunned, rallied quickly. Armed with better equipment, better training, and the backing of princes and churchmen alike, they crushed the rebellion with terrifying force. By the end of 1525, over 100,000 peasants lay dead. Villages were razed. Rebels were tortured, executed, or consigned to deeper poverty. The reformers distanced themselves. Luther, alarmed by the rebellion's radicalism, condemned the peasants in sharp, unforgiving terms. And what had begun as a cry for justice became a cautionary tale. Order had been restored, or so it seemed. But deeper questions remain. Was the Peasants' War merely a failed social revolt, or the first tremor of something larger? Some historians see in it the early seeds of modern revolution. Others argue it was too scattered, too theological to fit that frame. Still others suggest that the real threat it posed was not military, but symbolic, a world in which common people, for a brief moment, believed they could remake society. What's more mysterious is how quickly the memory of the war was buried. Unlike the French or Russian revolutions, the German Peasants' War left few monuments. Its leaders, like Münzer, were executed or discredited. Its documents, like the 12 Articles, were denounced and suppressed. Even centuries later, attempts to revive its memory by socialists, nationalists, and romantic poets were fleeting, fragmented, and often reimagined for new agendas. Why was such a massive uprising so thoroughly forgotten? Some point to the deeply hierarchical nature of post-war society, others to the religious divisions that followed, which redirected attention toward Protestant and Catholic conflicts. Still others propose that the war's meaning was too ambiguous, too uncomfortable to serve as inspiration. Was it a peasant revolution, or a theological revolt, a call for equality, or an eruption of chaos? And what if it was both? Archaeological traces have been found, hidden weapons, burned chapels, documents buried in cathedral archives, but many stories remain untold. Letters between rebel leaders hint at strategies and alliances we still don't fully understand. Rural folklore preserves songs and tales that may trace back to the rebellion, disguised, distorted, but lingering. And perhaps most intriguingly, some scholars speculate that more radical visions were discussed than ever made it into print. Visions of communal ownership, of land redistribution, of churches led by lay people, not clergy. Ideas that, in other centuries, would re-emerge under very different banners. What conversations were had around campfires in the forests of Swabia? What hopes were whispered among those who held scythes instead of swords? The German Peasants' War was not simply a failure. It was an eruption of memory, identity, and justice. A brief moment when the powerless stood tall and spoke aloud what had long been forbidden. And though their uprising was silenced, the questions they asked still echo, unanswered, waiting, hidden just beneath the soil of history. The winds that move across the hills of northern Haiti carry more than the scent of sugarcane and salt. They whisper through the ruins of plantation estates, through crumbling stone walls overtaken by vines, through the overgrown foundations of what were once palaces and garrisons. In the dim moonlight, the silent remains of Sans Souci Palace shimmer with a quiet grandeur, now a skeleton of empire, a memory of a revolution unlike any other in recorded history. The Haitian Revolution was not merely a war for independence. It was a world-altering upheaval, a mystery, a warning, a promise. But why is it still so often left out of the grand narratives of global history? In the late 18th century, the French colony of Saint-Domingue was the most profitable in the world. Fueled by brutal slave labor, its plantations produced sugar, coffee, indigo, wealth that flowed to Paris, enriching the elite and empowering the revolutionaries who would soon demand liberty, equality, and fraternity. Yet, on the same island, more than 500,000 enslaved Africans lived under a system of such violence, such calculated cruelty, that even contemporary European observers recoiled. Branding, mutilation, death by torture. These were not exceptions, but regular tools of control. The colony's wealth came at the cost of unimaginable human suffering. And then, in 1791, something extraordinary happened. A massive slave revolt broke out in the northern plains of the colony, organized, swift, and ferociously effective. Plantations burned. Armies of the enslaved began marching under unfamiliar banners. Within weeks, thousands were dead. The colonial authorities were stunned. What sparked the revolt? Historians point to many causes: the influence of the French Revolution, the spread of abolitionist ideas, the free black elite's demand for civil rights. But something deeper, more elusive, may have been at work. In the shadowed groves of Bois Caiman, legend speaks of a Vodou ceremony where enslaved leaders gathered, invoked ancestral spirits, and pledged blood and unity. The ceremony's historical accuracy is debated, but its symbolic power endures. Could the spiritual traditions carried across the Atlantic by enslaved Africans have played a role not only in sustaining resistance, but in coordinating it? The rebellion quickly grew into a war, complex, multi-layered, and filled with strange alliances. French, Spanish, and British forces intervened, each seeking to claim the colony or suppress the uprising. Yet against overwhelming odds, the rebel forces, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henri Christophe, outmaneuvered their adversaries time and again. Louverture, once enslaved, became governor of the colony under nominal French rule. He negotiated, legislated, and defended Saint-Domingue with military genius. But in 1802, Napoleon sent a vast expedition to restore control and, perhaps, reinstate slavery. The response was unyielding. The revolution deepened, hardened. The French forces were devastated, not only by Haitian tactics, but by disease, terrain, and the sheer resilience of the fighters. Louverture was captured and died in a French prison. But the revolution did not die with him. In 1804, Dessalines declared the colony's independence. Haiti, the world's first black republic, and the only nation born of a successful slave revolt, emerged. It was a shock to the global system. So why was the story buried? European and American powers immediately moved to isolate Haiti. France demanded reparations for lost property, including the enslaved, and Haiti was forced into crippling debt. The United States, still a slaveholding republic, refused recognition. For much of the 19th century, Haiti stood alone, politically ostracized, economically strangled, and, perhaps most consequentially, historically diminished. Official narratives treated the revolution as an anomaly. Some painted it as chaos, others simply ignored it. But to those watching, enslaved or colonized around the world, it was something else, proof that the impossible could happen. And yet, questions remain. How did an army of formerly enslaved people defeat some of the most powerful European empires of the era? Was the rebellion truly spontaneous, or had networks of resistance, both spiritual and political, been preparing for years? Were there external influences, letters, emissaries, unknown figures, who helped guide the revolution from the shadows? And what of the knowledge systems brought to the island from Africa? Oral traditions, political structures, ritual frameworks. How much did they shape the rebellion's resilience? There are stories, half recorded, of secret councils, of divine dreams, of coordinated uprisings far too sophisticated to have emerged overnight. There are patterns in the battle strategies that hint at shared memory, not just improvised resistance. Could the revolution have been the culmination of something older, something carried across oceans and preserved in whispered prayers and coded songs? Even within Haiti, traces of the revolution's deeper meanings lie hidden in music, language, ritual. The revolution was not just political, it was spiritual, cultural, cosmological. And perhaps that is why it still unsettles. For it was not just a rejection of slavery, but a rejection of an entire worldview. The Haitian Revolution turned the logic of empire upside down. It proved that those most violently oppressed could not only resist, but overthrow the system entirely. And in the silence that followed, the economic blockades, the historical erasure, the whispered fear in distant capitals, there is a question. What else was lost when this story was forgotten? What might we still uncover, not in official records, but in songs, in scars, in stones? Haiti's revolution did not vanish. It lives, in shadows, in memory, in a legacy too powerful to fully erase. And still, even now, its full story remains. Waiting. The air over Stone Town in Zanzibar often hangs heavy with the scent of clove and salt, as waves from the Indian Ocean gently kiss the crumbling coral stone buildings of this once gilded port. Narrow alleys wind past ornate doorways carved with Arabic script, where echoes of the past drift like incense through archways and shuttered balconies. It is here, in this ancient city, on the edge of Africa and Arabia, that one of the strangest episodes in colonial history unfolded, an event that burned bright and vanished almost as quickly as it began. A war that lasted less than an hour, the Anglo-Zanzibar War. But can a conflict truly be measured in minutes? Or is its brevity part of a deeper mystery, one that has yet to be fully uncovered? On the morning of August 27, 1896, a British ultimatum expired. Just 38 minutes later, the guns fell silent. It was, officially, the shortest war in recorded history. And yet behind that odd historical footnote lies a tale of imperialism, ambition, resistance, and shadows that still stretch across the Indian Ocean. Zanzibar, in the late 19th century, was a place of enormous strategic and economic value. An island sultanate that had once been part of the vast Omani maritime empire, it was a hub of commerce and diplomacy, where African, Arab, Indian, and European interests collided. Its markets were filled with ivory, spices, and enslaved people. Though slavery had been abolished in much of the world, Zanzibar's role in the Indian Ocean slave trade lingered far longer, operating through a labyrinth of local and regional networks. By 1890, Britain had secured Zanzibar as a protectorate, part of its broader campaign to control East Africa's coastline. Under this arrangement, the British exercised immense influence, but allowed the Sultan to rule in name. When Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, a British ally, suddenly died on August 25, 1896, possibly by poisoning, his cousin Khalid bin Bargash quickly seized the palace and declared himself ruler. The British, unconsulted and unwilling to accept a sultan they had not approved, viewed this move as a challenge. They issued an ultimatum. Khalid must step down by 9 a.m. on August 27th. He refused. At exactly 9:02 a.m., British warships anchored in the harbor opened fire. The bombardment was precise, devastating. The royal palace, a grand coral stone structure overlooking the sea, was reduced to rubble. Artillery emplacements were destroyed, and Khalid's small force, around 2,800 men armed with outdated rifles and a ceremonial cannon, crumbled almost immediately. By 9:40 a.m., the war was over. Khalid had fled to the German consulate. Roughly 500 Zanzibaris were dead or wounded. On the British side, one sailor was injured. So why then does this brief encounter still feel so unfinished? Some point to the deeper implications of Khalid's resistance. His defiance, however short-lived, represented a refusal to submit to foreign control, a stand against an empire that had increasingly turned Zanzibar into a pawn in the game of global dominance. Though history would record him as a footnote, Khalid's actions raised questions about sovereignty, legitimacy, and the limits of British influence. And then there is the matter of the palace itself. Eyewitnesses describe the bombardment as curiously targeted. Some claimed that only specific wings of the palace were destroyed, sections rumored to contain archives, private chambers, and collections of royal correspondence. Was the destruction simply aimed at defeating a rebellious sultan? Or was it also meant to erase documents, secrets, or alliances that had become inconvenient? No official inventory of what was lost in the fire exists. Could there have been letters revealing negotiations with other powers, Germany, perhaps, or the Ottomans? Were there records of resistance networks, or proof of clandestine trade routes still operating beneath British oversight? Speculative theories abound. Some suggest that Khalid bin Bargash may have been in possession of intelligence damaging to British interests, possibly involving the arms trade or unsanctioned slave routes still operating along the Swahili coast. Others propose a simpler explanation, that the war was meant not just to remove Khalid, but to send a message to other potential challengers. A message written not in words, but in cannon fire. Strangely, despite the war's official brevity, British forces continued to patrol and occupy the palace grounds for days afterward. Ships remained in the harbor. The new sultan, installed by the British, ruled with even less independence than his predecessors. The protectorate deepened. Zanzibar's autonomy faded, and its legacy as a sovereign trading power slipped into memory. But echoes linger. In the decades that followed, Khalid's story became the subject of rumor and legend. He eventually fled to German East Africa, where he lived under the protection of the Kaiser's empire until being captured during World War I. He never returned to power. But the questions surrounding his brief rule, and the rapid violence that ended it, remain curiously unanswered. Why was the British response so swift, so absolute? What was truly at stake in those 38 minutes? And what, if anything, was deliberately buried beneath the ruins of the Sultan's shattered palace? Today, the site of the royal palace is mostly gone. The ocean laps quietly at the seawall. Tourists walk the promenade, unaware of the bombardment that once shook this coastline. The story is remembered, when it is remembered at all, as a historical oddity, a trivia answer. But perhaps it was more. Perhaps the Anglo-Zanzibar War is not memorable because it was short, but because of how little we understand what it actually ended, and how much of its meaning may still lie beneath the surface, waiting, as all lost histories do, to be asked again. In the hushed corners of museum vaults and beneath layers of sand in the ruined cities of Iraq and Syria, clay tablets lie cracked and crumbling, scarred survivors of millennia. Their surfaces are etched with wedge-shaped signs, the ancient cuneiform script of Mesopotamia. Some have been deciphered. Many remain silent. But all whisper fragments of a world once so rich in stories, in gods and heroes, in cosmic struggles and sacred laws, that it rivaled, and perhaps shaped, everything that came after. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the most famous of these ancient narratives. Carved into stone and preserved in fragments across libraries and palaces, it tells the tale of a king searching for immortality. But what is often forgotten is that Gilgamesh was not alone. The lands between the Tigris and Euphrates were once filled with countless epics, myths, and cosmologies, many of which have vanished. What happened to these lost voices? Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, gave rise to the Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, and Assyrians. These cultures left behind a staggering record of administrative texts, astronomical charts, and religious hymns. Among them were also long poetic works, epics that spoke of creation, divine betrayal, mortal valor, and apocalypse. Some were read aloud in temples, others were copied by scribes as exercises in wisdom and devotion. But only a small fraction of these have survived. Archaeologists have uncovered roughly 500,000 cuneiform tablets. Of these, only a minority are literary, and of those, most are fragmentary. Torn edges, missing lines, entire tablets broken and scattered. Sometimes we find only the end of a story, or a single scene from what was once a sweeping mythic cycle. Names appear without context, gods speak without origin, battles rage without reason. Could these be remnants of epics now entirely lost? There are tantalizing hints. In the ruins of Nineveh, at the library of King Ashurbanipal, scribes cataloged texts with great care, grouping works by genre, subject, and origin. Among them are references to stories we no longer possess: the exploits of Ninurta, the journey of Enmerkar, the tale of Etana, the lament of Ur. Some are known from other fragments, others we know only by name. What were their plots? Their meanings? The Epic of Etana, for instance, survives only in pieces. A king searches for the plant of birth to give his wife a child. He rides on the back of an eagle toward the heavens. Then the story cuts off. What happens next? Does he succeed? Was this a tale of failed ambition or divine triumph? Even more mysterious is the Song of Ulikumi, a Hurrian myth preserved in later Hittite versions, possibly originating from the same Mesopotamian oral traditions. It tells of a stone giant who challenges the gods. Echoes of this motif appear elsewhere: giants born of the earth, battles in the sky. Could these stories have been shared, reshaped, rewritten across empires? Some scholars believe that Mesopotamia had its own mythic cycles, epics not unlike the Homeric poems of Greece or the Mahabharata of India. Grand narrative traditions that evolved through centuries of oral and written transmission, now mostly gone. Why were they lost? War, fire, neglect. The cities of Mesopotamia suffered centuries of conquest and collapse. The library of Ashurbanipal was buried beneath the ruins of Nineveh when the Medes and Babylonians destroyed the city in 612 BC. Temple libraries in Babylon, Nippur, and Ur were looted, their tablets scattered or ground into dust. Even when texts survived physically, their meaning was often lost as cuneiform fell out of use. And yet, could more remain, waiting beneath the soil? Many tablets remain unread, locked in archives or storerooms, their scripts too damaged, their language too obscure. Recent advances in imaging technology, infrared scanning, 3D modeling, machine-assisted decipherment, are beginning to shed new light on these ancient documents. A tablet dismissed as legal might hide a myth beneath eroded lines. A scribal exercise might preserve a stanza from a forgotten song. Could entire epics still be reconstructed from fragments? Could we one day read a Mesopotamian counterpart to Homer's Odyssey, long erased by time? There are also deeper, more speculative questions. Some researchers have wondered whether Mesopotamian myths carried insights or codes long forgotten. The gods they described, Enki, Inanna, Marduk, were more than characters. They were cosmological forces, symbols of time, chaos, knowledge, and fertility. Their stories were layered, recursive, often framed within numerical patterns. Were these narratives simply entertainment, or a way of encoding spiritual truths, astronomical data, or historical memory? In the myth of Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, Marduk defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat and fashions the world from her body. Echoes of this narrative can be found in other cultures: the slaying of chaos serpents, the formation of cosmos from primal matter. Is this convergence coincidental? Or do these stories point to a shared ancestral myth now lost in its earliest form? And what of the scribes themselves? Who chose which stories to copy, which to discard? Did political or religious changes suppress certain myths? Were some tales considered too sacred or too dangerous to preserve? The clay tablets do not answer. They wait. In the shifting dust of ancient cities, in the sealed crates of forgotten museums, in the computer models of modern linguists, the lost epics of Mesopotamia still stir. Not yet silent, not yet whole, and perhaps not yet truly lost. What truths did they once carry across centuries of memory? What dreams of gods, of men, of stars have slipped just beyond our grasp? And if we listen closely enough, might we still recover the voice of a forgotten world, buried in the clay, waiting to be read again? In the dry, wind-carved cliffs of Upper Egypt, near a bend in the Nile, a sealed clay jar lay buried for nearly 1,600 years. Inside were leather-bound codices, books of papyrus, hand-copied in Coptic, filled with unfamiliar gospels, mystical dialogues, and cryptic sayings attributed to Jesus. Discovered in 1945 near the town of Nag Hammadi, this accidental find would crack open a forgotten doorway into the earliest centuries of Christianity. A time not of unity, but of divergence. Not a single church, but many paths, many voices, some remembered, most silenced. Who were these early Christians? And how many of their stories have been lost? In the popular imagination, early Christianity often appears as a linear progression, a small group of followers, unified in belief, gradually spreading their faith across the Roman world. But the historical reality is far more complex and far more mysterious. In the first 3 centuries after the death of Jesus, there was no fixed canon, no singular authority. Communities across the Mediterranean, the Levant, North Africa, and Mesopotamia each interpreted his life and teachings in profoundly different ways. Some saw him as a divine being clothed in human form, others as a prophet touched by God. Still, others described visions of a cosmic redeemer descending through layers of reality, battling forces of darkness in a mystical drama far removed from the earthly ministry familiar to modern readers. How did these differences emerge so quickly? And why were so many paths eventually erased? From the Gospel of Thomas, discovered at Nag Hammadi, we hear a Jesus who teaches not through parables of judgment or law, but through riddles pointing inward. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift the stone, and you will find me. There is no crucifixion narrative, no resurrection account, no emphasis on sin or sacrifice. Instead, the path to salvation lies through self-knowledge. Elsewhere, in the Gospel of Mary, another suppressed text, we find Mary Magdalene not as a repentant sinner, but as a visionary disciple, entrusted with teachings the male apostles struggle to understand. Peter, in one passage, even questions her authority. Did he really speak these things to a woman, and not openly to us? Who preserved these texts, and who decided they were heretical? Throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, a fierce battle of interpretation unfolded. As some Christian communities sought cohesion, others remained decentralized, mystical, apocalyptic. The Gnostics, an umbrella term for various sects, believed the material world was a prison, crafted by an ignorant or even malevolent lesser god. For them, Jesus was a divine emissary of higher truth, come to awaken the divine spark within. This view clashed sharply with emerging Orthodox positions. Church leaders like Irenaeus of Lyons worked tirelessly to compile, defend, and enforce a more unified vision of Christianity, one centered on a bodily resurrection, the authority of the bishops, and the eventual selection of 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But Irenaeus himself admitted that many other texts were in circulation, that entire communities followed different scriptures, different rites. Some read from the Gospel of the Egyptians, others from the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Still others revered texts that have vanished entirely, lost to time, or perhaps deliberately destroyed. How much theological diversity was lost in the making of orthodoxy? The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, often viewed as a turning point, was not a spontaneous agreement, but the product of deep and enduring conflicts. The debates that raged there, particularly over the nature of Christ, were echoes of centuries of rival interpretations, and even after the Nicene Creed was established, alternate Christianities persisted on the fringes, in the deserts of Syria, in the valleys of Armenia, in the mountains of Ethiopia. Some of these traditions survive in fragmentary form, others have been reconstructed only through the writings of their opponents, but many remain elusive. What happened to the communities that followed these alternative paths? Were they gradually absorbed into the expanding Orthodox structure, or were they persecuted into silence? The destruction of early Christian texts accelerated in the late 4th and 5th centuries, when imperial power was increasingly wielded in service of doctrinal conformity. Libraries were purged, shrines were repurposed. Bishops who once debated their rivals began to wield the power of exile, and worse. Could more lost texts still lie buried beneath ancient cities or sealed in remote monastic vaults? Some believe the Nag Hammadi find was not unique, but one of many caches hidden by scribes who feared for their spiritual heritage. The Dead Sea Scrolls, though Jewish in origin, proved that entire libraries could remain hidden for millennia. And in the rugged terrain of Egypt, Syria, and Iraq, there may yet be places where the voices of early Christians have not been silenced, but merely waiting to be heard again. There are even more speculative theories. Some researchers propose that early Christianity was influenced by broader currents: Greek mystery religions, Egyptian cosmologies, Persian dualism. Were some of the lost Christianities shaped by initiatory traditions now forgotten? Could the figure of Jesus, in certain texts, have been part of a ritual structure we no longer recognize? And what of the role of women? Many of the alternative texts elevate female figures, Mary Magdalene, Thecla, Sophia, not as footnotes, but as bearers of revelation. Was this egalitarian vision deliberately suppressed, or simply overwhelmed by patriarchal systems already embedded in the Roman world? The early Christianities were not heresies. They were possibilities, paths not taken, stories not told. And in the silence left behind by their disappearance, the questions grow louder. How many Gospels were never written down? How many churches vanished without a trace? And how different might history look if just one of those lost voices had survived? The clay jars are still buried in the desert. The scrolls are still being pieced together. And somewhere, between the lines of what we think we know, early Christianity is still unfolding its many forgotten faces. High atop a sun-drenched ridge on the island of Crete, where the Aegean Sea stretches out in shimmering blue beneath cloudless skies, the ruins of Knossos lie quiet beneath the Mediterranean light. Massive staircases descend into rooms without windows. Corridors twist between frescoed walls, scenes of leaping bulls, flowing hair, and elegant ritual. Beneath it all, storerooms hold massive clay jars once filled with oil, wine, or grain. These are the remnants of the Minoans, Europe's first great civilization. And yet, by 1100 BC, they were gone. How could such an advanced and enduring society disappear? The Minoans flourished for centuries. From roughly 2000 to 1450 BC, they dominated the seas of the eastern Mediterranean. Their cities were unfortified, their palaces vast and labyrinthine. They developed one of the earliest systems of writing in Europe, Linear A, still undeciphered to this day. Their art radiated a love of life, nature, and movement, unlike the more martial iconography of their contemporaries in Egypt or Mesopotamia. Trade brought them copper, tin, ivory, and gold. Influence radiated from Crete across the Cyclades, into Anatolia, and even to the shores of Egypt. And then, quite suddenly, their power collapsed. Archaeologists long assumed that a single catastrophic event was to blame, most often the eruption of the volcano on the nearby island of Thera, modern-day Santorini. The eruption, which likely occurred around 1600 BC, was among the largest in human history. Ash rained across the Aegean. Tsunamis may have reached the shores of Crete. Some have speculated that this was the basis for Plato's later story of Atlantis, a high civilization buried beneath fire and sea. But the timeline doesn't fit neatly. Minoan culture persisted for at least a century after the eruption. Their palaces were rebuilt. Their ships still sailed. The bull leaping continued. So if not the volcano, what then? Around 1450 BC, something changed. The great palaces, Knossos, Melia, Phaistos, and others, were destroyed in a wave of fires, not by nature, by human hands. And in their wake, a new script began to appear on Crete, Linear B. Unlike Linear A, Linear B has been deciphered. It is an early form of Greek. Its presence signals something more than cultural exchange. It suggests conquest. Was Crete invaded by the Mycenaeans, the warrior kings of mainland Greece? Evidence from the archaeological record supports this theory. Mycenaean-style weapons, burial practices, and pottery begin to dominate the material culture of Crete after 1450 BC. The Minoan language disappears. Administrative records now bear Greek names, and the art, once flowing and organic, becomes rigid, martial, and restrained. But curiously, Knossos appears to have survived longer than the other palaces. Some believe it was used as a Mycenaean administrative center well into the 14th century BC. Was it spared in the initial destruction? Did it fall through negotiation rather than fire? Others wonder if the Mycenaean invasion was not a sudden conquest at all, but a gradual process, economic dominance turning into political control. Could elite Minoan families have intermarried with rising Mycenaean powers, surrendering independence in exchange for prestige or survival? And still, more mysteries remain. Why were the palaces destroyed with such precision? Why were some buildings leveled while others remained intact? Why do we find so few human remains amid the ruins? Did the Minoans flee? Were they absorbed? Or were they quietly extinguished, erased not by fire alone, but by silence? There are hints that internal instability may have played a role. Religious upheaval, economic collapse, or rebellion from within. The palaces functioned not just as royal residences, but as religious and bureaucratic centers. If faith in the ruling priest-kings faltered, could the society have unraveled from the inside out? And then there are the speculative theories. Some have pointed to the still undeciphered script of Linear A as a potential key. If we could read what the Minoans wrote about themselves, their laws, their gods, their fears, we might understand what truly happened. Others suggest that there were records, but they were deliberately destroyed, along with temples, symbols, and names. Did the Mycenaeans suppress Minoan culture, or did they inherit it and change it beyond recognition? What of the Minoan religion, centered around the enigmatic snake goddess and sacred caves? What became of their rituals, their festivals, their worldview? Some traces appear in later Greek myth, the labyrinth, the minotaur, the mother goddess. But these are distorted echoes, transformed by time, filtered through the lens of the conquerors. Could more direct evidence still lie hidden beneath layers of ash and earth? Crete remains only partially excavated. Earthquakes, political instability, and environmental concerns have slowed exploration. Whole complexes may lie buried still, sealed chambers, libraries, untouched storerooms. And what of Thera? Recent underwater surveys suggest that the Santorini eruption was even larger than previously thought, capable of affecting climate patterns for decades. Could a long-term environmental shift, crop failure, famine, dislocation, have weakened the Minoans from within, paving the way for external takeover? Or was it something else entirely? A sequence of slow collapses mistaken for one. Today, the frescoes of Knossos still gleam with vibrant reds and ochres. They show dancers, dolphins, sacred bulls. But the meaning behind the images is gone. The language that named them is unreadable. The songs, the prayers, the final words of a civilization that once ruled the waves are missing. What did the last Minoans think as the fires rose? Did they know they were the end of something great? Or did they believe, like so many, there would be another tomorrow? The palaces have fallen. The sea remains. And somewhere, perhaps still buried beneath Crete's rocky soil or Thera's ash, the answers wait, quiet and unremembered, beneath the fading brilliance of a forgotten world. In the highlands of southeastern Zimbabwe, beneath the acacia trees and open skies, massive stone walls rise from the earth, without mortar, without inscription, yet with a precision and permanence that defy time. These are the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a place both monumental and enigmatic. Granite boulders have been stacked with such mastery that even today, the outer walls of the great enclosure, some of them over 30 feet high and nearly 1,000 feet in circumference, remain almost perfectly intact. Inside, there are narrow stone passageways, tall towers, and concentric circles whose original purposes remain uncertain. There is no roof, no throne, no written record, only the stones and their silence. Who built this city? And why was it abandoned? Between the 11th and 15th centuries A.D., Great Zimbabwe was the heart of a powerful African kingdom, one that traded gold, ivory, and cattle across a vast region. Archaeological evidence suggests that at its height, the city may have housed as many as 20,000 people. Chinese porcelain, Arabian glassware, and Persian bowls have been unearthed from the soil here, hinting at far-reaching trade routes. The city was not isolated, it was connected, and it was wealthy. Yet curiously, for centuries, Great Zimbabwe was all but absent from global historical narratives. When European explorers first encountered the ruins in the 19th century, they refused to believe that local African peoples could have built such sophisticated structures. Instead, they proposed theories ranging from ancient Phoenicians to wandering Israelites. Some speculated that the Queen of Sheba had once ruled from this site. Others imagined a lost colony of Egyptians or Arabs projecting their own myths onto stones they could not or would not understand. But there was no evidence of foreign origin. The architecture, materials, and layout all point to indigenous African craftsmanship. The builders were likely ancestors of the Shona people, whose oral traditions remember Great Zimbabwe as a royal and sacred place. Iron tools, local quarrying techniques, and cultural continuity all affirm a native genesis. So why did early narratives resist this conclusion? And what else about Great Zimbabwe has been misunderstood or concealed? The word Zimbabwe itself comes from the Shona phrase Zimbabwe, houses of stone. But this was no ordinary city. It was a ceremonial and political center, a symbol of authority and cosmology. At its core stood the conical tower, a massive stone structure with no apparent entrance. Its function remains unknown. Some scholars believe it symbolized grain and fertility. Others see in it a representation of sacred kingship. No human remains have ever been found inside the tower. It may never have been entered at all. What purpose did it serve? The walls, too, are enigmatic. They do not surround homes, nor do they appear to be defensive. Instead, they guide and divide space, channeling movement, shaping ritual. The great enclosure and the hill complex above it may have served different ceremonial functions, perhaps separating royalty from commoners or the sacred from the profane. But the meanings behind their designs remain speculative. Even the decline of the city is unclear. By the late 15th century, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. Its political center shifted northward to sites like Kami and Mutapa. But why? Some archaeologists point to environmental degradation, overgrazing, exhausted soil, or deforestation. Others suggest political instability or changing trade routes along the Swahili coast. The arrival of Portuguese merchants in the Indian Ocean may have disrupted existing systems of exchange. Still, the timing is odd. Great Zimbabwe declined without signs of war or catastrophe. Its fall was gradual, quiet, and largely undocumented. Could the site have lost its sacred status? Was its abandonment the result of internal shifts in belief or royal succession? Even more intriguing are the artifacts left behind. Soapstone birds, stylized, abstract, and perched atop stone pillars, have been found throughout the site. They appear to have held symbolic or spiritual significance. Some have interpreted them as totems, others as representations of ancestors or divine messengers. 8 of these birds are known, and they have become a national emblem for Zimbabwe. But their exact meaning is lost. Were these birds part of a lost cosmology? A forgotten theology of flight and spirit? There is also the matter of what has never been found. No written texts, no carved glyphs, no monumental inscriptions declaring kings or victories. And yet, the site was clearly a seat of power. Could there have been a priestly class whose knowledge was transmitted orally? Did the rulers of Great Zimbabwe rely on ritual rather than text to sustain authority? Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is why the city was built in this form to begin with. No other known settlement in sub-Saharan Africa, before or after, employed stone architecture on this scale. The technology was unique, the aesthetic deliberate. Was Great Zimbabwe part of a larger cultural pattern we no longer recognize, one whose other centers have been lost to time, erosion, or conquest? Or was it truly singular? Today, Great Zimbabwe stands not in ruins, but in stillness. The grass grows between the stones. Tourists come and go. The surrounding hills watch, unchanged. The site has been reclaimed by its people, its myths restored to rightful origin. But the deeper meanings, the full story of what this place was, who built it, and why they left, remain veiled. What might still lie buried beneath the rubble or scattered through unwritten histories? And if the stones could speak, what would they say of the empire that once rose, quietly and magnificently, from the hills of Africa, and then faded into mystery? In the stillness of a pre-dawn ocean, beneath the glow of a sky untouched by modern light, a solitary outrigger canoe cuts across the vastness of the Pacific. Its sail whispers against the wind. Beneath its wooden hull, the world's largest body of water stretches endlessly in all directions. No land in sight, no compass in hand. And yet, its navigator knows precisely where he is. By reading the stars, the swells, the flight of birds, the color of the sea. This is not guesswork. It is knowledge, intimate, generational, precise. But where did this knowledge come from? And how far back do these stories really reach? Long before the age of European exploration, the peoples of Polynesia, Micronesia, and Melanesia had already mapped the ocean with astonishing accuracy. From Hawaii to Aotearoa, from Easter Island to the distant atolls of Micronesia, they sailed thousands of miles across open ocean without written maps or metal tools. Using memory, chant, and star lore, they found islands barely a mile wide in seas the size of continents. These were not accidental drifts on ocean currents. These were planned voyages, repeated, mastered. The earliest traces of Pacific voyaging date back over 3,000 years, beginning in the Bismarck Archipelago near Papua New Guinea. From there, the Lapita people, identified by their distinct dentate-stamped pottery, began pushing eastward. By 1000 BC, they had reached Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa. And then, there was silence. For nearly 1,500 years, expansion halted. This pause, called the Long Pause by scholars, remains one of the great enigmas of human migration. Why did the voyaging stop? Were there environmental shifts, social constraints? Or is the pause an illusion, born of missing archaeological evidence? When migration resumed around 800 AD, it did so with stunning scope and speed. Over the next few centuries, Polynesians reached Hawaii in the north, Rapa Nui, Easter Island, in the east, and Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the south, the widest oceanic diaspora in human history. And they left behind no monuments of stone empires, no written chronicles carved into walls. Instead, their histories were carried in chants, in genealogies, in navigational songs passed orally, from master to apprentice. How many of these histories have vanished beneath the waves of time? We know that some traditions survive. In the Caroline Islands, for example, the art of wayfinding, non-instrumental navigation, was preserved into the 20th century by masters like Mau Piailug. He taught using etak, an abstract mental system of reference points across the sea, built on the positions of stars, ocean swells, and even distant lightning. Polynesian navigation, it turns out, is as much philosophy as it is science. But without written records, how do we trace the full story of their movements? Recent studies in genetics, linguistics, and archaeology have helped reconstruct parts of the Pacific narrative. But the deeper we look, the more questions arise. Linguists find connections between distant island tongues. Geneticists trace the spread of chickens, rats, and yams across improbable distances. Some studies even suggest contact between Polynesians and pre-Columbian South Americans. Sweet potatoes, native to the Andes, were found across Polynesia long before European contact. Did Pacific navigators reach the Americas? If so, why do the oral traditions of most islands remain silent on these encounters? Was it a single voyage, long forgotten? Or were there sustained interactions, erased by time, or dismissed by scholars too quick to doubt? There is also the matter of the great stone monuments left behind. On Rapa Nui, the Moai statues gaze inland, their backs to the sea, their purpose still debated. In Tonga and Samoa, massive stone trilithons and star mounds suggest advanced engineering and celestial alignment. On Pohnpei in Micronesia, the ruined city of Nan Madol rises from a coral lagoon, an entire city built on artificial islets, its basalt structures weighing many tons. Were these constructions part of a broader, shared maritime culture? Or do they hint at regional kingdoms and priesthoods whose histories have been lost? Some oral traditions speak of distant homelands now submerged. Myths tell of sunken lands, of ancestral voyagers fleeing disaster, of gods who shaped the sea. While many of these are interpreted metaphorically, Could some preserve memories of real geological events, rising seas, tsunamis, or drowned archipelagos now erased from maps? Modern researchers have proposed that sea level rise following the last ice age submerged large portions of early Pacific settlement. Could entire chapters of this oceanic civilization be lying beneath the waves, villages, temples, or harbors now buried in silt? And what of the knowledge systems themselves? Chants that once encoded entire navigation maps have been forgotten. Rituals that once tied star charts to genealogy were broken under colonial pressures. Missionaries, settlers, and anthropologists, however well-intentioned, often recorded only fragments, filtering indigenous knowledge through foreign frameworks. What, then, have we lost, not only in terms of places and events, but of ways of knowing? The Pacific navigators did not simply move through space, they reimagined it. For them, the ocean was not empty, but filled with meaning. Swells had names, winds carried memory. Stars were not distant objects, but living markers of ancestral presence. In an age before satellites or sextants, they created a mental map of a world both vast and intimate. And today, that map is frayed, some of its lines erased, some of its islands still unaccounted for. How far did they really go? How many names were whispered over horizons that no longer have voices? And what deeper understanding of the world did they carry with them, across a sea that to most seemed impassable? The answers may not lie in texts or temples, but in rhythm, in wave, in the silence between stars, where stories once guided sails toward places never yet seen, but always known.